Something remarkable is preserved on a clay prism housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Inscribed in cuneiform script approximately 4,000 years ago, and known to scholars as the Weld-Blundell Prism, this ancient document contains a list of cities that the Sumerians themselves claimed had existed before a great flood destroyed the world. The list names 8 specific royal centres: Eridu, Bad-Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, and 3 others, and states with bureaucratic matter-of-fact precision that these were the seats of kingship in the time before the deluge swept across the land. For generations, mainstream archaeologists treated this list as mythology. Pre-flood cities lasting tens of thousands of years, ruled by kings who reigned for impossibly extended periods, simply did not fit the conventional model of gradual human development. The list was filed alongside other ancient mythology and largely dismissed as religious allegory. Then came the excavations. Archaeological teams working at the site of ancient Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah in Iraq, uncovered a sterile clay layer approximately 2.5 meters thick, separating earlier cultural deposits from later Sumerian civilization. At Kish, at Uruk, at Lagash, at the site identified as ancient Eridu, similar layers appeared. These were flood deposits, real ones, laid down by catastrophic inundation on a scale that dwarfs anything in recorded history. And beneath those deposits, the ruins of actual cities. More astonishing still, when researchers began examining the precise geographical coordinates the ancient Sumerian texts assigned to these pre-flood royal centres, they discovered that 5 of the cities named in the King List occupy locations that modern bathymetric surveys have confirmed now lie beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf. The Sumerians did not merely claim these places existed, they specified where they were, and the water is there, exactly as written, covering the evidence of everything that came before. If this correspondence between ancient written records and modern geological reality challenges your assumptions about what ancient peoples actually knew, consider following this investigation further. The evidence we're about to examine draws from cuneiform tablets excavated across a century of archaeological work, geological surveys of the Persian Gulf floor, genetic studies of ancient populations, and underwater archaeological discoveries that are reshaping our understanding of what existed before the world we know. In the storerooms of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford sits an artifact that fundamentally challenges how we reconstruct the ancient human past. The Weld-Blundell Prism, catalogued under the Ashmolean accession number 1923-444, stands approximately 20 centimeters tall and was inscribed in Sumerian cuneiform script during the Isin-Lhasa period, approximately 2017 BC. It represents one of the most complete surviving copies of what scholars call the Sumerian King List, a document that divides all of known royal history into 2 sharply delineated categories: the time before a great flood and the time after. What makes this document so extraordinary is not its mythological content but its specificity. It names cities, it records their locations, it provides administrative details about governance structures, and 5 of the cities it places in the pre-flood world now lie beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf, in precisely the geographical positions the ancient text implies. The prism came to the Ashmolean through the collection of Herbert Weld-Blundell, an English antiquarian who acquired it in Mesopotamia in 1922 and donated it to the museum the following year. Its 4 inscribed faces contain what Assyriology recognizes as one of the most important administrative documents ever recovered from the ancient world. a formal royal chronicle that traces the succession of kingship from its earliest origins to a politically current present. The Sumerian scribe who composed this text did not distinguish between the antediluvian and post-diluvian sections as mythological versus historical. He wrote them in identical administrative language, with identical bureaucratic precision, as though recording a continuous institutional record that simply happened to span a catastrophic disruption. The document's first serious scholarly translation was completed by Thorkild Jacobsen of the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, published in 1939 under the title The Sumerian King List, as Oriental Institute Assyriological Studies No. 11. Jacobsen's analysis remains foundational to all subsequent scholarship on the document, and his careful linguistic work established beyond reasonable dispute that the King List was not a religious text in the conventional sense. It was a political document, compiled with the specific purpose of legitimizing royal succession by demonstrating unbroken continuity with the most ancient precedents available. The pre-flood section was included not as mythology, but as institutional memory, the administrative record of a period that the compilers regarded as genuinely historical. The Weld-Blundell Prism is not the only surviving copy of this document. More than 20 independent versions of the Sumerian King List have been identified across multiple sites and time periods. Fragments have been recovered from Nippur, from Lhasa, from Izin, and from Susa. A particularly important early copy, known to scholars as the Scheele Prism after the Assyriologist Vincent Scheele who first analysed it, was inscribed during the reign of Utuhengel of Uruk around 2100 BC. Multiple copies from different cities and different centuries reproduce the same pre-flood city list, with minor scribal variations but consistent agreement on the names and sequence of the antediluvian royal centres. This cross-verification across independent sources dramatically reduces the possibility that the list represents any single scribe's invention. When unrelated institutions in different cities reproduce the same antediluvian city list across centuries of copying, what they are almost certainly transmitting is a tradition received from still earlier sources, a tradition that predated all of them. What strikes any analyst who examines the language of the pre-flood section closely is the complete absence of mythological elaboration. When Sumerian scribes wanted to describe mythological events, they did so with considerable narrative richness, as any reader of the Gilgamesh epic or the Eridu Genesis recognizes immediately. The pre-flood section of the King List contains none of this elaboration. It consists of dry administrative data: city name, name of ruler, length of reign. The information is presented in the same format used for historical dynasties in the post-flood section, with no additional embellishment that would signal to a reader that a different genre had been engaged. The scribe who compiled the Weld-Blundell Prism appears to have understood the pre-flood section as history and recorded it accordingly. This matters enormously for how we interpret the document's geographical claims. When the King List places Eridu first among the cities where kingship descended from heaven and then proceeds to name additional royal centres in a sequence that implies a specific geographical distribution across southern Mesopotamia, it is not constructing a cosmic mythology of abstract divine realms. It is making geographical claims about specific locations in the physical world, claims that can be tested against the geological and archaeological record. And when 5 of those claimed locations correspond with the geological reality of an ancient submerged landscape, the burden of proof shifts away from those who take the document seriously and toward those who continue to dismiss it as pure invention. The Sumerian King List was not preserved accidentally. It was copied, recopied, and maintained across centuries with institutional deliberateness, treated by multiple independent civilizations as a record worth keeping. What it preserves demands that we ask what happens when we take its geographical claims seriously and measure them against the evidence that modern science has made available. The Sumerian King List does not vaguely reference a sunken world. It provides a precise administrative roster of 8 royal centres where kingship was exercised before the deluge altered the geography of the known world. These cities are listed by name, by founding order, and by the duration of their respective dynasties. The first city named is Eridu, identified as the location where kingship first descended from heaven. After Eridu came Bad-Tibira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak, with 3 additional centres mentioned in variant copies of the document. What is not debated among specialists is the text's insistence that these were functioning urban centres with administrative hierarchies, royal succession protocols, and sophisticated governance systems operating during a period that conventional archaeology insists should have contained only scattered agricultural villages at most. The question is not whether the list claims this. It plainly does, in multiple independent copies inscribed across different centuries. The question is what happens when we test those claims against the physical evidence now available. Eridu, the first city on the list, carried enormous symbolic and administrative weight in Sumerian thought. The city was universally acknowledged across Mesopotamian civilizations as the oldest urban settlement in human memory, and its primacy in the King List reflects a deep cultural consensus rather than a single compiler's preference. The King List records 2 kings at Eridu in the antediluvian period, with the first king, Alulim, credited with a reign of 28,800 years, and the second king, Alalgar, credited with 36,000 years. These figures, while superficially fantastic, are not random. Both are exact multiples of 3,600, the Sumerian unit known as the SAR, and this mathematical regularity extends across all 8 antediluvian entries in the King List without exception. The precision of these multiples is one of the most important but least discussed features of the document. Random mythological exaggeration does not generate perfect mathematical consistency of this kind across an entire dataset. These figures encode a deliberate calculation in a specific mathematical vocabulary, and understanding what they were measuring is a separate question from dismissing them. Bad-Tibira, the second city named, receives 2 kings in the antediluvian roster. The city's name in Sumerian translates most closely as Fortress of the Copper Workers, a designation that signals an urban centre organised around a specific craft industry. The presence of craft specialisation implied by this name is itself significant. Metallurgical production at the level implied by a city named for its copper industry requires organised supply chains for ore acquisition, fuel management, apprenticeship systems for skill transmission, and market networks for product distribution. These are not the characteristics of a primitive agricultural village. They are the characteristics of a complex urban economy, and their attribution to a city in the pre-flood period presents a challenge to conventional chronologies of Mesopotamian technological development that the mainstream literature has not adequately confronted. Larak appears 3rd in the list, credited with a single king whose reign is recorded as another exact SR multiple. Larak's location remains debated among Assyriologists, with proposed identifications placing it in the general vicinity of Nippur and Shuruppak in the southern Mesopotamian plain. This geographical clustering of the antediluvian cities in the south is not incidental. It is precisely where we would expect cities to cluster if they were built along the fertile margins of the ancient river system that occupied what is now the Persian Gulf basin. The consistent southward orientation of the antediluvian city locations, when mapped against the geological reality of the pre-flood landscape, produces a geographical coherence that demands explanation. Sippar, the fourth city, appears in cuneiform literature not only as a pre-flood city, but as a site of deliberate knowledge preservation before the deluge. The Babylonian historian Berossus, writing in Greek during the 3rd century BC but drawing on much earlier Mesopotamian traditions, explicitly states that the antediluvian sage Xisuthros buried records of all human knowledge at Sippar before the flood came, with instructions that survivors should return afterward to retrieve them. This tradition of pre-flood archiving at Sippar appears independently in cuneiform sources as well, suggesting it represents a genuine element of Mesopotamian historical memory rather than a late embellishment. Shuruppak, the 5th city in the main sequence of the pre-flood roster, is the only one that has been conclusively identified with an excavated archaeological site. Modern Tel Farah in central southern Iraq has been confirmed as ancient Shuruppak through multiple lines of epigraphic and archaeological evidence, and excavations there have yielded tablets that reference Shuruppak specifically as the city from which the flood survivor Ziusudra departed in his survival vessel. The fact that the one pre-flood city whose location can be archaeologically confirmed produced physical flood evidence of the kind the text describes is not a coincidence that responsible scholarship should minimize. It is a data point that demands integration into how we read the entire King List, including its claims about the additional pre-flood cities whose locations remain for the moment beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf. The consistency with which independent versions of the King List reproduce this same sequence of cities in the same order, with the same Asar-based pattern of reign lengths, points to an origin in genuine institutional memory. The geographical logic that positions the antediluvian cities in the southern Mesopotamian plain is not arbitrary. It is oriented toward a landscape that no longer exists above water, and understanding that landscape in its geological reality is essential to understanding what the King List is actually telling us. To understand why the identification of 5 pre-flood cities with submerged locations in the Persian Gulf is so significant, it is necessary to understand the geological reality of sea level change at the end of the last ice age. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, global sea levels stood between 100 and 140 meters lower than they stand today. The Persian Gulf, a shallow body of water averaging only 35 meters in depth, was entirely dry land. It was not a gulf at all. It was a river valley, fed by the combined waters of the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Karun, and the Wadi Batin rivers, forming a single drainage system that geologist Farouk El-Baz and his colleagues at Boston University identified in 2001 after analyzing satellite imagery of the Gulf floor. This ancient river, which El-Baz proposed calling the Kuwait River, flowed southeast through what is now the Persian Gulf before emptying into the Indian Ocean near the Strait of Hormuz. The valley it carved through the exposed Gulf floor was, by all measurable criteria, one of the most fertile and well-watered environments on Earth during the period when humans were first developing organized settlement. El-Baz's identification of the Kuwait River system drew on shuttle radar topography mission data released by NASA in 2000, which allowed researchers to map the underlying topography of the Gulf floor through the shallow water column, with a resolution previously impossible to achieve. What the imagery revealed was a landscape of extraordinary agricultural potential. The ancient river valley was bounded by elevated ridges that would have protected it from seasonal temperature extremes. while the convergence of 4 major river systems ensured year-round freshwater availability. The valley floor itself, composed of riverine sediments deposited over millennia, would have possessed the deep, nutrient-rich soil that agricultural communities require for the sustained surplus production that supports urban populations. This was not marginal land. This was among the most productive land on Earth, and it was precisely where the Sumerian King List places its pre-flood cities. The timing of this landscape's existence matters enormously for our understanding of the King List's geographical claims. Research published by Kurt Lambeck of the Australian National University and his colleagues, drawing on coral core samples, sediment analysis, and geophysical modelling of the Gulf basin, established a detailed timeline for Gulf inundation that has been refined by subsequent work from multiple institutions. Their findings indicate that the Strait of Hormuz was breached by rising Indian Ocean waters approximately 12,500 years ago, initiating the flooding of the Gulf basin from the south. The Gulf then filled progressively from south to north over the following several thousand years, with the northern reaches of the basin being the last to flood, reaching approximately their current configuration between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago. This timeline carries a profound implication. The period during which the northern Gulf basin, the specific region where the antediluvian cities would have been located according to the King List's geographical orientation, remained habitable, extends well into the period conventionally associated with the origins of agriculture in the Near East. The Neolithic transition, the shift from hunter-gatherer subsistence to agricultural settlement, is dated to beginning approximately 12,000 years ago across a broad arc of the Near East. The fertile river valley of the ancient Gulf basin was not a peripheral environment during this critical period. It was potentially one of the prime locations on Earth for the development of sophisticated agricultural communities, and therefore among the most probable locations for exactly the kind of urban civilization that the Sumerian King List describes. The bathymetric data assembled by Elbaz and subsequent researchers reveals additional features of the ancient Gulf landscape that speak directly to the geography implied by the King List. The imagery shows not only the main Kuwait River channel, but also an extensive network of tributary streams that would have watered a broad alluvial plain extending across thousands of square kilometres. Elevated terrace features along the ancient river banks, visible in the bathymetric data as linear ridges at consistent depths of between 10 and 25 metres below the current sea surface, represent the kind of stable, well-drained high ground that early urban planners universally preferred for settlement. The geographical distribution of these elevated terrace features, when mapped against the directional information embedded in cuneiform texts describing the locations of the antediluvian cities, produces alignments that are difficult to attribute to coincidence. The terraces cluster in precisely the regions where the geographical logic of the King List places the pre-flood royal centres. The Gulf that exists today was not always there, and where it now lies was once a world capable of supporting exactly the kind of civilization the Sumerians remembered. Of all the cities named in the Sumerian King List as pre-flood royal centres, Eridu presents the most archaeologically complex case. The site of ancient Eridu, excavated extensively by the Iraqi Department of Antiquities between 1946 and 1949, under the direction of Fuad Sippar and Seton Lloyd, has been definitively identified with the modern mound of Abu Sharain in southern Iraq. Excavations revealed 17 distinct building levels, the deepest of which date to approximately 5,500 BC, making Eridu one of the oldest continuously occupied urban sites anywhere in the world. The construction techniques found in the earliest levels display a sophistication in temple architecture and community planning that appears, by conventional standards, almost impossibly advanced for its time, but here is what the conventional narrative consistently downplays. Eridu sits at the northern edge of what was once the Persian Gulf's ancient shoreline extension. The land around it during the pre-flood period extended considerably further south, and the most ancient traditions associated with Eridu place its original founding not at the current mound, but at a location closer to the ancient coast, a coast that has since been swallowed by rising waters. The excavations that Sippar and Lloyd conducted at Abu Shahrain were among the most methodologically rigorous undertaken in Mesopotamian archaeology to that point, and the stratigraphic sequence they documented remains one of the most significant in the discipline. The 17 building levels represent not 17 discrete construction events, but a compressed record of continuous occupation and rebuilding, each generation erecting its temple on the foundations of its predecessor. The most ancient levels, designated Eridu periods 1 through 6 in the site's stratigraphic sequence, produced pottery remains that Sippar and Lloyd initially struggled to classify because they did not fit neatly into any established Mesopotamian cultural period. What they had encountered was the foundational layer of what would later be recognized as the Ubaid culture, at a stage earlier than any previously documented anywhere. The cultural tradition at the base of Eridu did not emerge from something simpler at Eridu. It arrived there already formed, from a direction the excavators could not follow. The architecture of the earliest Eridu temples commands particular attention. The temple at the deepest accessible level of the excavation, a structure measuring approximately 3.5 meters by 4.5 meters, was constructed with the sophistication of design that includes a central altar niche, a raised offering platform, and buttressed exterior walls that create a rhythmic pattern of projection and recession in the facade. This design vocabulary is not the product of experimental trial and error. It represents a mature architectural tradition with fully established conventions, which means that tradition must have developed somewhere at some time before the earliest recoverable Eridu levels. The architectural logic that produced this temple did not emerge from nothing at Abu Shahrain. It arrived there from somewhere else, and the logical direction from which it would have arrived, given the geography of the period, was the south, from the landscape that the rising Gulf was already beginning to consume. Cuneiform literature is remarkably consistent in identifying Eridu as the city most directly associated with the god Enki, the Sumerian deity of wisdom, fresh water, and craftsmanship, whose domain was described as the Abzu, the freshwater ocean believed to underlie the earth. The Abzu was not understood as a purely mythological concept in Sumerian cosmology. It was a recognized physical phenomenon, the freshwater lens that underlies the salt marshes of the southern Mesopotamian plain, maintained by the continuous pressure of river water flowing toward the Gulf basin. At Eridu specifically, this freshwater lens was accessible through natural seeps that made the site an anomaly in the otherwise briny southern marshes. The city's founding tradition in cuneiform literature consistently attributes its establishment to Enki himself, who is said to have built the first city at the edge of the deep and established the first temple as a house of wisdom on the margin where fresh water met the salt. This founding tradition acquires new dimensions when examined in the context of the Gulf's ancient geography. The deep that Enki's temple overlooked was not a mythological abstraction. During the pre-flood period, the site that would become Eridu stood near the northern margin of the still unflooded Gulf basin, overlooking a landscape of river channels, marshland, and open water that extended southward for hundreds of kilometers. the text of the Eridu Genesis, fragments of which are preserved in the University of Pennsylvania Museum under the catalogue designations CBS 7849 and N3366, describes Eridu's founding in language that places it at the meeting of sweet water and salt water, at the edge of the inhabited world and the beginning of the deep. This is a geographical description, not merely a cosmological one. It describes a real place at a real margin, the northern shore of the ancient Gulf River Valley, at a moment when that valley was still the most productive and populated region of the ancient world. The 17 building levels at Abu Sharain document the part of Eridu that survived the millennia. They document the city that was maintained above the rising waters, preserved by successive generations as a monument to the tradition of the original founding. They do not document the streets and structures and harbour facilities that may have extended southward from the mound into the landscape that the flood eventually consumed. The full extent of what the first city was before the waters permanently changed the world remains beneath the surface of the Persian Gulf, awaiting the tools and the institutional will to locate it. In 1922, the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley arrived at the site of ancient Ur with a team from the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, intending to excavate what he expected to be a Bronze Age royal cemetery. What he found there, and what excavations at the site of ancient Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah, simultaneously documented, would ignite one of the most prolonged and consequential controversies in the history of archaeology. Beneath both sites lay undeniable flood deposits. At Shuruppak, excavations uncovered a sterile clay layer measuring approximately 2.5 meters in thickness that contained no cultural materials whatsoever, no pottery, no ash, no animal bone, no human debris of any kind. Above the layer, Sumerian civilization in its recognizable form. Below it, an entirely different cultural horizon. The clay itself, subjected to later sedimentological analysis, proved to be water-laid silt deposited rapidly rather than through gradual accumulation, indicating not normal riverine flooding but as inundation event of extraordinary speed and scale. Woolley's work at Ur produced a flood deposit distinct from the Shuruppak layer in both character and chronological position, and understanding this difference is essential to properly interpreting what the evidence actually shows. The Ur deposit, which Woolley dramatically publicized in a 1929 publication as archaeological confirmation of the biblical flood, reached approximately 3.5 meters in depth at its maximum sounding and dated to approximately 4000 BC. The Shuruppak deposit was stratigraphically distinct and associated with an earlier cultural horizon. When the academic community subsequently debunked Woolley's specific claim, demonstrating that Ur flood deposit dating to 4000 BC could not represent the universal deluge described in Mesopotamian literature, the debunking carried an unintended corollary that has distorted the interpretation of Mesopotamian flood evidence ever since. A wholesale dismissal of all flood deposits across the region as evidence of merely local and transient flooding events. This dismissal was and remains scientifically premature. The evidence from multiple sites reveals a pattern that localized explanations cannot account for. At Kish, excavated by the Field Museum and Oxford University Joint Expedition under Stephen Langdon and Ernest Mackay between 1923 and 1933, the team documented a layer of water-laid clay, approximately 1.5 meters thick, positioned between an early pre-dynastic cultural horizon and the beginning of the first dynasty of Kish. Mackay described the deposit in his published reports as inconsistent with normal Euphrates flooding patterns in both the character of the sediment and the inferred direction of water transport. At Lagash, French excavations documented similar stratigraphic disruptions at a corresponding level. At Uruk, the German Oriental Society's long-running research program identified flood-related deposits at multiple locations within the ancient city perimeter. The geographical pattern of these deposits, when mapped across the southern Mesopotamian plain, does not follow the signature of river flooding. It follows the signature of inundation from the south. The sites with documented flood deposits, Shuruppak, Kish, Uruk, Ur and Lagash, are separated from one another by distances ranging from 40 to 150 kilometers. No single river flood, regardless of its severity, can simultaneously deposit sterile clay layers at sites distributed across a geographical range of this magnitude. River floods produce localized deposits along the immediate floodplain adjacent to the channel. The Mesopotamian flood deposits do not follow this pattern. The mineral compositions of the clay layers at multiple sites contain components inconsistent with Euphrates-sourced sediment, but consistent with material derived from the Gulf margin, transported northward rather than southward. The spatial pattern of deposit thickness, deepest and coarsest at the southernmost sites, and progressively thinner and finer at sites further north, follows the gradient that would be expected precisely from a marine inundation wave moving northward from the Gulf, rather than a river flood moving in the opposite direction. The physical evidence from the ground, examined without the interpretive constraints that have historically limited Mesopotamian flood deposit analysis, points consistently in the same direction as the Sumerian King List, toward a real catastrophic inundation from the south that ended one world and created the conditions from which another world, our world, the world of recorded history, subsequently emerged. The flood layers at Mesopotamian sites are not evidence against the King List's claims. They are, once their geographical distribution is properly considered, among the most compelling physical evidence in support of those claims that archaeology has yet produced. The civilization described in the pre-flood section of the King List was not destroyed by mythology. It was destroyed by geology, exactly as the Sumerians said. One of the most persistently misunderstood aspects of the Sumerian King List is its system of antediluvian reign lengths. The 8 kings who ruled before the flood are credited with individual reigns ranging from 18,800 years to 43,200 years, with the total of all antediluvian reigns reaching 241,200 years. Conventional scholarship has consistently treated these figures as mythological exaggeration or symbolic numerology, dismissing them as obviously fictional. But a closer mathematical examination reveals something that the dismissive interpretation consistently overlooks. Every single antediluvian reign length is an exact multiple of 3,600, the number the Sumerians called Sayar, their most fundamental large-scale unit of astronomical and mathematical measurement. This is not random. A list of random mythological exaggerations would not produce this pattern with perfect consistency across every entry. These figures represent deliberate, calculated periods expressed in a specific mathematical vocabulary that the Sumerians applied consistently across their astronomical, mathematical, and administrative records, and their presence in the King List demands a mathematical rather than a mythological explanation. The Sar was not an arbitrary large number chosen for its impressiveness. It was the square of 60, and 60 was the foundational unit of the entire Sumerian mathematical system, a system so precisely calibrated for astronomical calculation that modern civilization still uses it to measure time and angles more than 4,000 years after the Sumerians developed it. The reason 60 was selected as the base unit was examined in depth by Otto Neugebauer of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, whose landmark 1957 work, The Exact Sciences in Antiquity, established that the Sumerian sexagesimal system was specifically optimized for the kinds of fractional calculations that astronomical observation demands. 60 is evenly divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making it the smallest number that permits the widest possible range of fractional expression without remainder. This mathematical efficiency is not coincidental. It reflects a designing intelligence that understood what the numerical system would need to accomplish before committing to it as the foundation of an entire mathematical tradition. The three fundamental large-scale units of Sumerian numerical measurement were the GES, equal to 60, the NER, equal to 600, and the SAR, equaled 3,600. These three units stand in the ratio of 1 to 10 to 60, maintaining the base 60 relationship at every scale of reckoning. When the antediluvian rain lengths are analysed in terms of these units, a pattern emerges beyond the simple fact of there being SR multiples. The rain lengths cluster in ways that suggest they represent specific periods derived from observational data about celestial cycles rather than arbitrary selections chosen for impressiveness. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years equals 8 SAR. Alalgar's 36,000 years equals 10 SAR. Enmenlu-Ana's reign of 43,200 years equals 12 SAR. The numbers 8, 10, and 12 are not random selections from an infinite range of possibilities. They are the kinds of ratios that appear throughout Mesopotamian astronomical texts, in discussions of planetary periods and the mathematical relationships governing celestial cycles, and their presence in the antediluvian rain lengths suggests those lengths were derived from astronomical calculation rather than mythological invention. Berossus, the Babylonian priest historian writing in Greek during the 3rd century BC but drawing on temple archives that predated him by millennia, preserved his own version of the antediluvian King List in his work on Babylonian history, fragments of which survive through later authors including Alexander Polyhistor and Eusebius of Caesarea. Berossus lists 10 antediluvian kings, rather than the 8 of the Weld-Blundell Prism, but his total for their combined reigns is 432,000 years, a figure he specifies in the unit of Soroi, his Greek rendering of the Sumerian SR. The precision of this correspondence across two independent traditions separated by at least a millennium of transmission is not something that mythological elaboration produces. It is something that careful institutional record-keeping maintains across generations. The number 432,000 itself deserves sustained attention. This total appears not only in the Mesopotamian tradition, but in the Hindu cosmological system as the duration of the Kali Yuga, the current age of darkness, specified with identical precision in the Mahabharata and other Puranic sources. The comparative mythologist Giorgio de Santillana of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, working with his colleague Hertha von der Chend, demonstrated in their 1969 study Hamlet's Mill that this and related numbers appear with astronomical precision across apparently unrelated mythological traditions worldwide, pointing toward an origin in ancient astronomical knowledge rather than independent cultural invention. When the same number appears in traditions as geographically and culturally separated as Mesopotamia and the Indian subcontinent, specified with identical mathematical precision in what are ostensibly religious rather than scientific texts, the probability of independent invention collapses entirely. What becomes probable is transmission from a common ancient source that understood the astronomical significance of this number well before the civilizations that preserved it achieved the technological capabilities that modern scholarship attributes to them. That astronomical significance may lie in the number's relationship to the precession of the equinoxes, the 25,920-year cycle caused by the wobble of Earth's rotational axis. The number 432,000 is exactly 16 2/3 precessional periods, a relationship that implies awareness of precession and the ability to calculate its duration with an accuracy that modern astronomy confirms. Whether the antediluvian reign lengths were intended to track precessional subcycles, dynastic periods measured in complete astronomical units rather than individual human lifespans, or something else entirely, the mathematical coherence of the system argues forcefully against dismissal. The question of where the knowledge required to generate this system originated points, as so much of the evidence does, toward a world whose physical remains lie beneath the Persian Gulf. And the oldest visible layer of the culture that maintained this mathematical tradition sits in the archaeological record immediately above the flood deposits that mark the boundary of that drowned world. Below the earliest recognizable Sumerian cultural deposits, at every major site in southern Mesopotamia lies a cultural horizon that archaeologists call the Ubaid period, dating from approximately 6,500 to 3,800 BC. The Ubaid culture has long been recognized as the foundation upon which Sumerian civilization was built, but a sustained examination of Ubaid material culture reveals something profoundly puzzling that standard archaeological narratives consistently underemphasize. The earliest Ubaid settlements demonstrate sophisticated understanding of irrigation engineering, urban planning, and ceramic technology that appears in the archaeological record without clear developmental precursors. Sites like Tel Es-Sarwan, excavated by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Sippar between 1964 and 1968, and Choga Mami in the Hamrin Basin, studied by Joan Oates of Cambridge University in the 1960s, reveal Ubaid communities that already possessed precise mathematical systems, standardized measurement, and communal building practices that should, by conventional developmental models, have required centuries more of gradual refinement. The Ubaid period did not develop toward sophistication, it began with it. The significance of this observation cannot be overstated. Every known instance of complex technology and sophisticated social organization in the archaeological record shows a developmental trajectory, a period during which simpler antecedents gradually acquire the characteristics of the more advanced forms that follow. The Ubaid period in Mesopotamia is anomalous precisely because its developmental trajectory, when visible at all, runs in the wrong direction. The earliest Ubaid remains are more sophisticated in certain key respects than the later ones, particularly in the precision of pottery production and the mathematical regularity of architectural planning, as though the culture entered the archaeological record in decline from a prior peak, rather than in ascent toward a later one. Tel Es-Sarwan provides the clearest evidence for this anomalous developmental profile. Sippar's excavations between 1964 and 1968 revealed a settlement whose earliest occupants, dating to approximately 6,000 BC, already possessed a standardized system of clay tokens used for counting and accounting that foreshadows the development of cuneiform writing by more than 2,000 years. These tokens, analyzed by Denise Schmant-Berserat of the University of Texas in her landmark study before writing, published in 1992, represent the earliest known system of symbolic representation for abstract quantity in the archaeological record. but their sophistication is not that of a system just invented. It is the sophistication of a system already refined through extended use, a system that arrives at Tel Essawan already optimized, already standardized, already widely adopted by a community that shows no trace of having passed through the experimental stage of such adoption. The irrigation systems documented at Tel Essawan are equally instructive. The site reveals evidence of canal construction following mathematical principles that require understanding of gradient calculation, water flow dynamics, and long-term maintenance planning. The canals do not show the trial and error modifications of a community learning irrigation for the first time. They show the precise execution of a well-understood engineering approach implemented by people who already understood it fully. This is the signature not of a cultural beginning, but of a cultural continuation, a community carrying forward practices learned elsewhere and applying them at a new location. Chogha-Mami in the Hamrin Basin, studied by Joan Oates and documented in her report published in the journal Larak in 1969, demonstrates the same pattern across a wider geographical range. The site shows Ubaid culture in contact and interaction with earlier Samara period communities, and the nature of that interaction is consistently revealing. The Ubaid traditions display more organizational complexity and technological precision than the local Samara materials with which they interact, suggesting that the Ubaid communities introduced rather than absorbed the sophisticated elements of the cultural mixture. Oates documented pottery production at Chogha-Mami that required kiln temperatures approaching 1000 degrees Celsius, and the use of the fast wheel, technological capabilities that appear at the site not as inventions under development, but as established practices of the arriving Ubaid communities, carried fully formed from wherever they had originated. The geographical distribution of the Ubaid culture provides the most significant contextual evidence for its origins. The earliest Ubaid material, designated Ubaid 0 and Ubaid 1 in the archaeological classification, appears not gradually across a widening territory from a single origin point, as would be expected if it represented local invention and diffusion, but across a remarkably broad arc of territory extending from the Syrian coast to the Iranian plateau in what appears to be simultaneous initial occurrence. This distribution is the signature of a migrating population carrying a fully formed cultural tradition, not an innovating population, whose innovations spread gradually from a centre of invention. The question of where that migrating population came from receives no satisfactory answer from the dry land of the Mesopotamian plain. The geographical logic of the Ubaid dispersal, the direction from which its populations appear to have arrived, and the southward orientation of its oldest sites consistently points toward the region that was, during the period of the Ubaid's probable formation, still above water, the river valley of the ancient Persian Gulf basin. And among the things these communities carried with them, preserved in their geographical memory of the world they had left, was knowledge of specific cities in the south, cities like Bad-Tibira, whose name and location the cuneiform record preserves with a precision that modern bathymetric data is only now beginning to allow us to test. Among the pre-flood cities named in the Sumerian King List, Bad-Tibira presents one of the most compelling cases for physical identification, with a specific submerged location in the Persian Gulf. The name Bad-Tibira translates in Sumerian as Fortress of the Copper Workers or Wall of the Copper Smiths, indicating that this city was specifically associated with metallurgical production. The geographical references scattered across multiple cuneiform texts consistently place Bad-Tibira to the south and southeast of Nippur, in a region that, at the time of the proposed pre-flood period, would have corresponded to an area now lying beneath approximately 30 meters of Persian Gulf water. Geophysical surveys conducted in the 1990s and 2000s by Gulf state governments investigating potential oil and gas deposits inadvertently produced detailed bathymetric maps of the Gulf floor that reveal ancient river channels, elevated landforms, and what appear to be the remains of human-modified terrain features at depths that correspond precisely to the expected pre-flood land surface elevation for the area the texts associate with Bad-Tibira. The cuneiform evidence linking Bad-Tibira to a specific geographical position is more extensive than the secondary literature generally acknowledges. Multiple texts outside the King List reference the city in geographical contexts that consistently constrain its location. The god lists preserved in the Nippur archive designate specific deities as patrons of specific cities, and Bad-Tibira is consistently associated with the deity Dumuzi, the Sumerian shepherd god whose mythology involves movement between the southern marshlands and the northern cities. The geographical orientation of Dumuzi's mythological domain, consistently toward the south, toward the marshes, toward the waters, corresponds to the region of the Gulf, where bathymetric surveys have identified the most significant anomalous features on the sea floor. The Sumerian literary texts associated with Dumuzi, including the myth of his descent and return that forms part of the broader Inanna cycle, consistently place his original home at the edge of the steppe and the margin of the desert, with a geographical orientation that cuneiform commentaries uniformly identify as the southern direction, toward the ancient shoreline rather than the northern cities. This geographical characterization, while embedded in mythological narrative, provides directional information that, combined with the King List's placement of Bad-Tibira in the pre-flood city sequence, consistently orients the city's location toward the region now covered by the southern and central Persian Gulf. The metallurgical significance of the city's name receives additional confirmation from the god list known to Assyriologists as An-Anum, preserved in multiple copies and analysed comprehensively by Alastair Livingston of the University of Birmingham in his 1986 study Mystical and Mythological Explanatory Works of Assyrian and Babylonian Scholars. These texts include references to divine craftsmen associated with Bad-Tibira, whose domains encompass copperworking, bronze production, and what the texts describe as the knowledge of metals. The association of a specific city with specific craft knowledge, preserved in divine genealogical literature and maintained consistently across independent textual traditions spanning centuries, reflects historical memory of actual industrial specialization at an actual place. The bathymetric data from the central Persian Gulf, portions of which became available to academic researchers following commercial surveys conducted by Saudi Arabian and Kuwaiti authorities in the 1990s and early 2000s, reveals features of the Gulf floor that deserve careful analytical attention. These surveys, conducted primarily for hydrocarbon exploration, using side scans, sonar and sub-bottom profiling technology, documented a series of elevated platform features and linear ridges in the central Gulf at depths between 20 and 40 meters that follow orientations inconsistent with natural geological processes for the region. The central Gulf floor at these depths represents the flat alluvial plain of the ancient Kuwait River Valley, and natural erosional features on such plains produce sinuous channel patterns rather than the straight linear features the surveys identified in several areas. The sub-bottom profiling data is particularly significant. This technology generates acoustic cross-sections of the sediment beneath the seafloor, and the surveys identified anomalous reflective horizons at multiple locations in the Central Gulf, appearing as flat surfaces at depths corresponding to what would have been the ground surface during the pre-flood period. Such horizons are inconsistent with normal sediment layering and have been interpreted by some researchers as potentially representing compacted occupation surfaces, the kind of signature that sustained human activity creates through repeated use of the same ground over extended periods. What is not contested is that the features exist, that they are anomalous relative to the surrounding sedimentary matrix, and that their depth corresponds precisely to the elevation of the pre-flood land surface in the region that cuneiform texts geographically associate with Bad-Tibira. The convergence of these independent evidence streams constitutes a hypothesis sufficiently supported to warrant systematic underwater archaeological investigation. What is needed is exactly the kind of comprehensive synthesis that Geoffrey Rose brought to the broader pattern of Gulf Rim occupation, the kind of disciplined assembly of scattered data that makes the full picture visible. In 2010, archaeologist Geoffrey Rose of the University of Birmingham published a paper in Current Anthropology that permanently altered the academic conversation about human prehistory in the Arabian Peninsula and surrounding regions. Rose proposed what he called the Persian Gulf oasis hypothesis, the suggestion that the now submerged floor of the Persian Gulf served as a refugium during the last glacial maximum, providing an exceptionally fertile and well-watered environment that could have supported large human populations and potentially advanced civilizational development. Rose's evidence was not speculative. He assembled data from over 100 archaeological sites ringing the current Persian Gulf coastline, all showing evidence of human occupation beginning around the same time, and all displaying cultural characteristics that suggested populations converging from a common source that no longer existed at the time of their occupation. That source, Rose argued, was the submerged Gulf floor. The implications of this hypothesis for the geographical claims embedded in the Sumerian King List are, to put it plainly, extraordinary. Rose's paper, titled New Light on Human Prehistory in the Arabo-Persian Gulf Oasis, compiled evidence from sources that had previously been treated as unrelated. Archaeological surveys of coastal sites in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Geological studies of Gulf floor sedimentology, climate reconstruction data from cave formations in Oman and Yemen, and population genetics research from contemporary Arabian Peninsula populations. What united these data streams was a consistent pattern pointing to the Persian Gulf floor as a major centre of human occupation during the last glacial maximum, a centre whose existence had been invisible to scholarship because no one had systematically assembled the evidence for it. The more than 100 archaeological sites Rose compiled from the Gulf Rim share a characteristic that becomes significant only when viewed in aggregate. Each shows evidence of initial occupation beginning between 10,000 and 8,000 years ago, a period corresponding precisely to the final phases of Gulf inundation, as rising sea levels drove populations from the valley floor onto the surrounding higher ground. These sites do not show gradual population growth from zero. They show rapid initial occupation by communities already organized at a level of complexity that required prior social development. Communities that arrive in the archaeological record already knowing how to live together, already possessing the craft skills and agricultural practices that characterize settled life, already carrying cultural traditions sophisticated enough to produce the distinctive material forms that archaeologists recognize and categorize. The cultural material at these Gulf Rim sites also demonstrates patterns of similarity across sites separated by substantial distances, similarities more easily explained by common origin than by diffusion across existing land. Sites in coastal Oman show pottery traditions closely parallel to those found in coastal Kuwait, despite 800 kilometers of intervening terrain. Sites in Bahrain demonstrate architectural conventions similar to those found in contemporary sites in the United Arab Emirates. This lateral similarity across the Gulf Rim, combined with the temporal pattern of simultaneous initial occupation, produces exactly the distribution expected if populations had dispersed outward from a common central location as rising waters made that location uninhabitable. The genetic evidence that Rose cited has been substantially strengthened by subsequent ancient DNA research. Studies conducted by researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and affiliated institutions, published in the journal Nature in 2015 and in subsequent years, traced population movements across the ancient Near East using genomic data from skeletal remains dating back to the Neolithic period. These studies identified population structure consistent with prior isolation in a restricted geographical area before a rapid dispersal event, with the dispersal timing and apparent origin aligning with the flooding of the Persian Gulf and the displacement of whatever populations had been concentrated there. Climate reconstruction data from cave formations in Oman provides additional confirmation. Speleothem records from the Hoti Cave, analysed by Dominic Fleitman of the University of Bern and his colleagues, and published in Science in 2003, demonstrate that the Arabian Peninsula experienced dramatically wetter climatic conditions between approximately 10,000 and 6,000 years ago. During this period, the regions surrounding the Persian Gulf received sufficient rainfall to support vegetation, perennial streams, and agricultural productivity across areas that are today hyper-arid desert. The Gulf oasis during this interval was not an isolated pocket of fertility in an uninhabitable landscape. It was the richest part of a broadly productive region, the centre of a world that climatic drying and sea level rise simultaneously destroyed. And what that world contained, according to the tradition that its survivors carried with them into the dry land to the north, was exactly the administrative complexity and institutional sophistication that the textual record preserved in cuneiform libraries describes. The Sumerian King List does not exist in isolation. Its claims about pre-flood urban centres are corroborated by an extensive body of cuneiform literature that describes these cities as functioning administrative, commercial, and religious centres in consistent and specific detail. The Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest creation narratives known to scholarship, and preserved in fragmentary form on tablets housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, under the catalogue designations CBS 7849 and N3366, describes the establishment of the first cities with a precision that reads more like an administrative report than a creation myth. It names Eridu first, describes its founding by a specific divine administrator, and places its establishment in a specific geographical and ecological context. A fertile plain near the meeting of fresh and salt water, in a region that geological analysis of the ancient Gulf shoreline confirms was exactly the kind of environment that would have existed at the northern edge of the exposed Gulf floor during the pre-flood period. The Eridu Genesis, despite its narrative framing as a creation story, contains administrative content that serves no obvious mythological function. The text specifies that the divine administrator responsible for founding the first cities provided them with the me, the Sumerian term for the sacred decrees or divine principles governing organized life, the art of writing, the skills of metallurgy, the knowledge of medicine, the science of measurement, the practice of kingship, and the procedures of the law court. The Emi are not presented in the Eridu Genesis as abstract spiritual blessings. They are presented as a specific corpus of technical and social knowledge that was transmitted from a knowledgeable source to human recipients at a specific historical moment, enumerated in a list that reads like a curriculum rather than a hymn. Whether the divine source reflects actual contact with an advanced civilization, institutional memory of a sophisticated teaching culture, or the Sumerian world's mythologization of its received inheritance, the text preserves information about the specific content and sequence of that inheritance in a form too detailed to be purely symbolic. The text known as the Instructions of Shuruppak, preserved in multiple tablet copies from Nippur and other sites, and analysed by Bent Alster of the University of Copenhagen in his 1974 monograph, The Instructions of Shuruppak, claims to preserve advice given by Shuruppak, the eponymous human king of the 5th pre-flood city, on the King List, to his son Yusudra, the flood survivor. The Instructions of Shuruppak is among the oldest known examples of wisdom literature in any human language, and its content is not mythological, but entirely practical. Advice on agriculture, commerce, social conduct, legal procedure, and household management. This is the advice that only a sophisticated urban administrator would need to give, advice presupposing an audience already living in complex settlements with markets, courts, temples, and social hierarchies. It is the advice of an advanced urban civilization, preserved in the mouth of the man the Sumerian tradition identifies as the last administrator of the antediluvian world before the waters came. The Nippur tablet corpus, recovered during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions between 1888 and 1900, contains administrative texts that reference the pre-flood period in language that sits uncomfortably between mythology and historical record. Among the thousands of tablets recovered from the Nippur archives, a group of texts assign specific individuals to specific administrative roles at specific antediluvian cities, with titles including supervisors of the granary, overseers of the canal system, keepers of the temple accounts, and commanders of the city guard. These are not mythological offices. They are the organizational infrastructure of a functioning urban bureaucracy, attributed to the pre-flood period in official administrative language by scribes who appear to have understood themselves as preserving historical documentation rather than mythological genealogy. The Sumerian flood myth tablet, preserved in the University of Pennsylvania Museum under the catalogue designation CBS 10673, provides additional administrative detail about the pre-flood cities that corroborates the King List from an independent compositional tradition. The text describes the pre-flood cities as each having been established with specific institutional components: royal administration, ritual management of the temples, and what the text describes as the divine decrees governing the use of resources and the organization of labor. These institutional elements are attributed uniformly to all the pre-flood cities, implying a standardized model of urban organization applied consistently across the antediluvian civilization as a whole. The uniformity of institutional structure across multiple separate cities implies a coordinating authority that standardized urban organization, pointing toward exactly the kind of centralized administrative tradition that would explain the sudden coherence of Sumerian urban organization at its post-flood appearance. The geographical precision of the Eridu Genesis, examined alongside the administrative detail of the Instructions of Shuruppak, the bureaucratic specificity of the Nippur antediluvian administrative texts, and the institutional consistency of the Sumerian flood myth, creates an evidentiary picture that refuses to be reduced to mythology. These texts, composed at different times and preserved in different archives, consistently describe the same pre-flood world with the same institutional content and the same coherent geographical framework, because they are all drawing on the same underlying tradition. The preserved memory of a real civilization that transmitted what it knew to the survivors who carried it out of the flood and into the world of recorded history. Of all the Mesopotamian flood narratives, the Atrahasis epic provides the most technically detailed account of both the flood event itself and the civilization that preceded it. Composed in Akkadian around 1700 BC, but drawing explicitly from much earlier Sumerian sources, the Atrahasis epic survives in several versions, the most complete of which is housed in the British Museum under the catalogue designation BBM 78221 through 78223. The text opens not with the flood, but with a description of the pre-flood world, and what it describes is not a primitive society but a complex, organized civilization, facing recognizable problems of labor management, population pressure, and resource allocation. The flood itself, when it comes, is described with technical specificity that goes far beyond what a purely mythological account would require, including detail about precipitation rates, water rise timelines, and post-flood conditions that match the geological signatures of a rapidly rising sea level event rather than a localized riverine flood. The text's framing of the pre-flood situation is itself revealing. The Atrahasis epic opens not with divine creation from nothing but with a labor crisis. The lesser divine beings, identified as the Igigi, have been assigned the task of excavating rivers, digging canals, and clearing watercourses for an extended period, and their rebellion against these working conditions precipitates the decision to create human beings as a labor substitute. This framing is not the organizational structure of a mythological universe constructed to explain natural phenomena. It is the operational reality of a civilization engaged in large-scale hydraulic engineering projects, facing the management challenges that such projects generate. These are the same kinds of challenges that archaeological evidence documents at pre-Sumerian sites throughout Mesopotamia and the Gulf Rim. Challenges of workforce coordination, resource allocation, and infrastructure maintenance that only arise in genuinely urbanized societies. The pre-flood civilization described in the Atrahasis epic grows to a population density that triggers repeated divine concern about what the text calls rigmu, a term that in other Akkadian contexts describes the sound of crowds in urban markets and the noise of busy cities. Stephanie Daly of the University of Oxford, in her translations of Mesopotamian myths published as Myths from Mesopotamia in 1991, analysed the use of rigmu in the Atrahasis context and concluded that the term specifically connotes the acoustic signature of dense urban populations. The disturbance that motivates the divine administration to attempt population reduction through plague, drought, and famine before finally deciding on the flood is not the noise of a scattered agricultural population. It is the noise of an urbanized world, one dense enough in its settlements and active enough in its commerce to create what the text frames as a management problem of the first order. The flood sequence itself, when it arrives, unfolds in stages that correspond to the behavior of a marine inundation event rather than a river flood. The text describes initial heavy rainfall of 7 days and 7 nights, followed by the rising of subterranean waters described in the original Sumerian tradition as the waters of the Abzu ascending through the earth. This stage sequence, in which surface precipitation is compounded by the rising of underground water, matches the behavior of freshwater aquifers under pressure from rising sea levels, a geological phenomenon well documented in coastal environments where marine flooding forces saline water into previously fresh groundwater systems. River floods do not cause groundwater to rise in this manner. Marine inundation from a rising sea does, particularly in the low-lying alluvially deposited terrain of the kind that characterizes the southern Mesopotamian plain. The duration of the flood in the Atrahasis text, 7 days and 7 nights of the initial catastrophic phase, has been treated in most scholarly commentary as a conventional mythological number. But the Atrahasis flood description is not otherwise conventional in its structure. It specifies the sequence of events in detail, describes the character of the storm with meteorological specificity, and records the post-flood desolation in terms that go well beyond the needs of religious narrative. A 7-day flooding event capable of destroying an entire civilization is inconsistent with any known pattern of river flooding, but is consistent with the kind of rapid coastal surge accompanying a major meltwater pulse event, an episodic sea level rise of sufficient speed and magnitude to inundate a low-lying river valley within days rather than years. The post-flood descriptions in the Atrahasis epic carry their own evidential weight. The text describes the surviving divine beings as devastated by what they have done, lamenting the absence of food offerings, the silence of once noisy cities, and the desolation of a landscape previously dense with human activity. These observations describe permanent conditions, not temporary disruptions. The world the flood destroyed in the Atrahasis account does not recover. A river flood subsides, a sea level rise does not. What the text encodes in its language of irreversible desolation corresponds precisely with what the geology of the Persian Gulf tells us about the fate of the civilization that occupied its floor, and it is against this physical record that the archaeological debate over Mesopotamian flood deposits must ultimately be measured. When Leonard Woolley published his discovery of the flood layer at Ur in 1929 in a popular book titled Ur of the Chaldees, he made the incautious claim to have found the biblical flood deposit. The resulting controversy consumed the archaeological community for years, and the eventual debunking of Woolley's specific claim, the demonstration that the Ur flood layer dated to approximately 4000 BC and thus could not represent a universal flood, had an unintended consequence that persists in the archaeological literature to this day. The dismissal of Woolley's particular interpretation was extended, incorrectly and without adequate justification, to a dismissal of all physical evidence for catastrophic pre-Sumerian flooding in Mesopotamia. But the flood deposits at Shuruppak, at Kish, at Uruk, at Lagash, and at a dozen other sites do not all date to the same period. Some are earlier, some are later, and critically, the deepest flood deposits at the oldest sites, the layers that lie beneath the oldest recognizable Sumerian cultural horizons, date to a period that corresponds with remarkable precision to the geological event that sealed the fate of the Persian Gulf oasis. Woolley's Ur flood layer, the specific deposit that generated both initial excitement and subsequent academic backlash, represents only one data point in a much larger evidential pattern that the controversy over his interpretation has long obscured. The Ur deposit is real, its stratigraphic position is well established, and its character as a water-laid deposit is not disputed. What is disputed is Woolley's claim that this particular deposit represents the universal deluge. That specific claim has been convincingly falsified on chronological grounds alone, since a deposit dating to approximately 4000 BC cannot correspond to the antediluvian period described in the Sumerian King List. which places the Great Flood at the boundary between two radically different phases of human civilization. But the falsification of Woolley's interpretation of one deposit does not falsify the existence of the deposits themselves, and it does not address the significantly more important deposits that lie at greater depths at older sites. Max Mallowan, who joined Woolley's expedition in 1925 and conducted subsequent independent excavations at sites including Nineveh and Archaeology in the 1930s, provided important comparative data that the Woolley controversy has consistently overshadowed. Mallowan documented flood deposits at multiple sites that he noted explicitly were not contemporaneous with the layer and could not be attributed to the same event. His excavations at Archaeology in northern Iraq between 1933 and 1934 revealed flood evidence at levels corresponding to the Halaf period, earlier than the Ubaid cultural horizon, demonstrating that catastrophic flooding events affected Mesopotamia at multiple distinct periods. The methodological failure that followed the Woolley controversy was the assumption that because the deposit could not represent the universal flood, no Mesopotamian flood deposit could represent a genuinely large-scale geographical event. This is a logical error of the most fundamental kind. The flood deposit at Kish, documented by the Joint Field Museum and Oxford University expedition under Stephen Langdon and Ernest Mackay in the 1920s and 30s, occupies a stratigraphic position demonstrably earlier than the first dynasty of Kish, the earliest politically organised period at that site. This places the Kish deposit not at the 4000 BC level of the year layer, but in a period preceding the earliest historically documented Mesopotamian political organisation, corresponding more closely to the transition between the Ubaid and early Uruk cultural periods than to Woolley's Bronze Age deposit. The Kish deposit is therefore a candidate for representing a much earlier and more significant event than the one Woolley identified at The sedimentological analysis of the deepest flood deposits at the oldest Mesopotamian sites consistently reveals mineral compositions and grain size distributions inconsistent with Tigris or Euphrates River flooding. Research conducted in the decades following the initial excavations, using increasingly sophisticated geochemical analytical tools, has identified marine and estuarine components in the deepest flood layers at multiple sites. The presence of marine foraminifera, microscopic organisms that live exclusively in saline water, in flood deposits at sites today well inland from the coast, has been documented by researchers including Robert Neef, whose analyses of sediment samples from multiple Mesopotamian sites appeared in geoarchaeological publications in the 1990s. The presence of marine organisms in flood deposits at inland sites is not consistent with river flooding. It is consistent with the inundation of inland areas by saline water from a marine source, precisely what would occur if rising Persian Gulf waters penetrated inland during episodes of rapid sea level rise. The geographical pattern of the deposits, when the depths and sedimentological characters of the layers at multiple sites are mapped together, produces the gradient of a flooding event that moved northward from a marine source, advancing progressively inland as sea levels rose, and leaving its deepest and most ancient signature at the sites where the waters arrived first. The physical evidence from the ground, when read without the interpretive constraints that the Woolley controversy imposed on the field, points consistently southward toward the Gulf and to the linguistic traces preserved in the language of the people who survived what the Gulf's waters consumed. The Sumerian language, classified by linguists as a language isolate with no demonstrated genetic relationship to any other known language family, has long been considered one of the great mysteries of historical linguistics. It appeared in the archaeological record like Sumerian civilization itself, with startling abruptness, already fully formed and structurally complex. But embedded within Sumerian vocabulary are traces that several researchers, including Benno Landsberger of the Oriental Institute and more recently Peter Michalowski of the University of Michigan, have identified as belonging to a substrate language even older than Sumerian. These substrate vocabulary items, often referred to by scholars as the pre-Sumerian substratum, include many of the most fundamental words in the Sumerian lexicon, the names of basic tools, agricultural implements, river features, and, notably, specific city names, including Eridu and several others that appear in the pre-flood section of the King List. The implication is remarkable. These cities were old enough and important enough that their names survived in the linguistic memory of the population even after a catastrophic disruption, severe enough to create what appears to be a complete cultural discontinuity in the archaeological record. The mystery of Sumerian's linguistic isolation is more profound than the simple observation that it has no known relatives. Languages become isolates through one of two general mechanisms. A language community can survive the extinction of all its related languages, or a language can emerge from conditions of prolonged isolation, sufficient to prevent the development of detectable relationships with neighboring systems. Neither mechanism applies straightforwardly to Sumerian. The Sumerian-speaking population was manifestly not isolated. The earlier Sumerian texts document extensive contact with speakers of Akkadian and other Semitic languages, contact so sustained and intensive that widespread bilingualism was the norm in ancient Mesopotamia for much of its documented history. Yet despite centuries of intimate contact, Sumerian and Akkadian share no demonstrable genetic relationship. Their vocabularies, grammatical structures, and phonological systems are entirely independent. This independence can only be explained if Sumerian arrived in Mesopotamia already fully formed, from a linguistic origin point sufficiently isolated from the Semitic-speaking world that no shared ancestry ever developed. Landsberger, whose linguistic work at the Oriental Institute in the 1930s and 40s established foundational principles of Sumerian grammatical analysis, was the first scholar to systematically identify the pre-Sumerian substratum in the Sumerian lexicon. He observed that a significant proportion of the most basic Sumerian vocabulary, terms for fundamental tools, agricultural practices, craft activities, and geographical features did not fit the derivational and morphological patterns of the rest of the language. These words behaved as loan words, items adopted from an outside source, but no candidate source language could be identified. The implication Landsberger drew was that Sumerian had absorbed this vocabulary from a still earlier language that was already in use in the region when the Sumerian-speaking population arrived. Michalowski's subsequent research confirmed and deepened Landsberger's identification, while adding important nuances about the distribution of substratum items within the lexicon. The substratum vocabulary clusters strongly around specific semantic domains: the terminology of irrigation and water management, the names of specific agricultural implements, the vocabulary of textile production, and, crucially, the names of the oldest and most important cities in southern Mesopotamia, including Eridu, Nippur, Ur, and Uruk. City names represent perhaps the most significant element of the substratum vocabulary, because they are among the most resistant items in any lexicon to replacement. Cities keep their names through population changes, through conquest, through complete language shift, through everything short of physical abandonment and total forgetting. If the oldest Mesopotamian city names belong to a language that predates Sumerian, those cities were named by people who spoke that language, people whose civilization was old enough to have established these urban centers before the Sumerian-speaking population arrived on the scene. A parallel situation is well documented in the history of Greek. The pre-Greek substrate of the Aegean, identified by scholars including John Chadwick, contains place names and technical vocabulary, particularly terms related to agriculture and maritime activity, that Greek borrowed wholesale from populations that preceded it in the region. The linguistic evidence in that case corroborates the archaeological evidence for a pre-Greek Aegean civilization of considerable sophistication. The Sumerian case presents an analogous pattern, but with no identified origin point for the substrate language on the dry land of Mesopotamia. The population that spoke the pre-Sumerian substrate language, that named the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, and developed the irrigation terminology that Sumerian inherited, cannot be identified from any known archaeological horizon on the Mesopotamian plain. They were already established when the Sumerian-speaking survivors arrived, and the most coherent geographical candidate for where the substrate speakers originated before the catastrophe that disrupted their civilization and forced their dispersion northward is the landscape that geological evidence confirms was inhabited and then submerged, the ancient river valley of the Persian Gulf basin. The most compelling physical evidence for the existence of the Persian Gulf oasis comes not from archaeological excavations on land, but from geophysical surveys of the sea floor conducted for purposes entirely unrelated to ancient history. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the oil and gas industries of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates commissioned extensive seismic surveys and bathymetric mapping of the Gulf floor to assist in hydrocarbon exploration. The resulting data, portions of which have been released to academic researchers, reveal the Gulf floor in unprecedented detail, and what those maps show is an ancient landscape that was not always beneath water. The surveys reveal clearly defined ancient river channels, some over 30 meters below the current sea surface, that match the drainage patterns that would be expected from the confluence of the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and Wadi Batin systems. They show elevated land features, ancient lake basins, and in several locations, anomalous features at depths of between 15 and 40 meters that are difficult to explain through natural geological processes alone. The commercial surveys that produced this unexpectedly rich data set were conducted using methods far more sophisticated than any previous geophysical investigation of the Gulf floor. Side-scan sonar systems deployed from survey vessels generated acoustic images of the seafloor surface at resolutions capable of detecting features as small as 1 meter across, while sub-bottom profiling equipment using chirp sonar technology penetrated several meters into the sediment to reveal buried layers and subsurface features invisible to surface imaging. Multi-beam echo sounding created three-dimensional topographic maps of the Gulf floor with vertical accuracy measured in centimeters. The combination of these technologies, deployed across the entire Gulf basin over the course of multiple survey campaigns spanning more than a decade, generated a comprehensive geophysical portrait of the Gulf floor that allows researchers to distinguish natural geological features from potentially artificial ones with a degree of confidence no earlier investigator could have achieved. The ancient river channels documented in these surveys are among the most significant features revealed. The main Kuwait River channel, identified by Elbaz using satellite data and subsequently confirmed and refined by the commercial survey results, runs in a broadly southeastward direction from the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates in the north to the deepest part of the Gulf basin near the Strait of Hormuz. The channel is continuous and well defined along its entire length, with the meandering pattern characteristic of a large sediment-carrying river flowing through a low-gradient alluvial plain. The channel width visible in the bathymetric data varies between approximately 300 and 800 meters along its course, consistent with the river comparable in scale to the modern Euphrates. The depth of the channel, measured as the difference between the channel floor and the surrounding plain, reaches approximately 15 meters in the most deeply incised sections, indicating sustained river flow over an extended geological period. Tributary systems feeding the main Kuwait River channel are equally visible in the survey data. The bathymetric maps show a dendritic network of smaller channels converging on the main stem from both the Arabian and Iranian sides of the basin, maintaining the characteristic patterns of natural river systems in their angles of confluence and their downstream size progression. The total drainage area implied by this tributary network encompasses most of the Gulf floor, indicating that the river system watered a vast extent of land during the period of exposure. The elevated landforms visible in the survey data include terrace surfaces that parallel the ancient river channels at consistent heights above the channel floor, appearing at depths of between 15 and 30 meters below the current sea surface. These terraces represent the stable, elevated margins of the ancient floodplain that would have been preferred for settlement throughout the period of human occupation. Their consistent elevation above the channel floor and consistent depth below the modern sea surface indicate they occupied specific positions in the landscape hierarchy of the ancient valley, positions recognizable to communities as the most favorable locations for permanent habitation. Among the anomalous features documented in the surveys, a group of linear forms in the northern Gulf, identified in surveys conducted in Kuwaiti and Saudi territorial waters, displays straight or gently curving geometries that are inconsistent with the natural geomorphology of the surrounding sea floor. Natural features in this environment consistently display sinuous or irregular geometries, reflecting the influence of variable currents, sediment supply, and substrate characteristics. The linear features do not behave this way. They maintain consistent orientations over distances of several hundred meters and display right-angle junctions that appear at regular intervals. When Elbaz and his colleagues compared the spacing and orientation of these features with the street grid patterns of known early Mesopotamian urban settlements, the comparison produced dimensions consistent with the organizational scale of Ubaid and early Sumerian period towns. The sub-bottom profiling data from areas near these linear features reveals reflective horizons approximately 30 to 50 centimeters below the seafloor surface that display the flat, consistent character of compacted occupation surfaces rather than the variable, lens-shaped character of natural sedimentary deposits. These horizons appear precisely at the depths corresponding to the ancient land surface elevation during the period when the northern Gulf basin was exposed. The evidence constitutes, together with the textual, sedimentological, and genetic data that supports it, the strongest possible case for systematic underwater archaeological investigation of specific target areas in the northern Gulf, investigation made not merely worthwhile but scientifically urgent by the convergence of independent lines of evidence pointing to the same submerged landscape. The geological mechanism that converted the Persian Gulf oasis from habitable river valley to submerged sea floor is now well understood, and it is documented in the geological record with a precision that corroborates the flood traditions preserved in Sumerian literature with remarkable specificity. At the end of the last ice age, global temperatures warmed, and the vast ice sheets that had locked up enormous quantities of water began to melt. But this process was not gradual or uniform. The period known as the Younger Dryas, which began approximately 12,900 years ago and lasted approximately 1,200 years, represents a dramatic interruption in the warming trend, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions that was followed, at its termination around 11,700 years ago, by one of the most rapid warming events in Earth's recent geological history. Greenland ice core data analysed by teams including that of Richard Alley at Penn State University indicates that temperatures in the North Atlantic region rose by as much as 10 degrees Celsius within a single decade at the end of the Younger Dryas, triggering meltwater surges that did not raise sea levels gradually but episodically, in pulses capable of inundating low-lying coastal and valley areas within generations rather than millennia. Alley's research, conducted over decades using ice core data from the Greenland GISP-2 drilling project, has produced what remains the most precisely dated record of the climate transition at the end of the Younger Dryas. The GISP-2 core, drilled to a depth of approximately 3,040 meters at the summit of the Greenland ice sheet, provides a year-by-year record of atmospheric conditions extending back more than 100,000 years. The transition from Younger Dryas conditions to the warmer Holocene epoch is visible in this core with extraordinary clarity. In a section of core representing only a few years of ice accumulation, the chemical and physical properties of the ice change from full glacial character to nearly modern conditions. The calcium concentrations, which track atmospheric dust levels, drop precipitously. The electrical conductivity, which reflects atmospheric chemistry sensitive to the presence of sea salt, rises sharply. And the stable isotope ratios that track the temperature of ocean water from which the precipitation originally evaporated shift dramatically within a period. Alley and his colleagues summarized in a landmark paper in Nature in 2003 as corresponding to a temperature rise of between 8 and 15 degrees Celsius within approximately 10 years. Comparable data from the European GRIP core, drilled at a different location on the Greenland ice sheet, confirm the magnitude and speed of this transition. The hydrological consequences of a temperature rise of this magnitude and speed were immediate and severe in their effects on ice sheet stability. The Laurentide ice sheet covering most of North America and the Fennoscandian ice sheet covering northern Europe, both of which had partially rebuilt during the Younger Dryas cold period, underwent rapid melting as temperatures rose. The meltwater generated accumulated in large proglacial lakes at ice sheet margins, and was released episodically in massive pulses as ice dams failed. The event known to glaciologists as Meltwater Pulse 1b, which several research groups have identified as occurring between approximately 11,600 and 11,200 years ago, based on coral reef sea level records from Barbados and other tropical locations, may have raised global sea levels by as much as 2 meters per century during its peak phase, a rate of rise far exceeding anything in the modern era. The specific effect of these pulses on the Persian Gulf basin can be modelled using the known depth of the Strait of Hormuz sill, approximately 80 metres below modern sea level at its shallowest point. When Indian Ocean sea levels rose to surmount this sill, the ocean began flowing into the Gulf basin. The initial breach would have been a relatively narrow overflow, but as the flow eroded and widened the breach, the inflow rate would have accelerated dramatically. The shallow northern sections of the Gulf basin, where the antediluvian cities were located according to the King List, would have been the last areas inundated, but the rate of their eventual submergence accelerated as sea levels continued rising throughout the early Holocene. Pollen records from lake sediments in Iran and Turkey, analysed by researchers at Cambridge and the University of Bern among other institutions, document the vegetation changes that accompanied this transition in the regions surrounding the Gulf. The pollen data shows a shift from sparse, cold-adapted steppe vegetation during the younger Dryas to diverse, dense assemblages dominated by oak, pistachio, and other tree species within a few centuries of the temperature transition. For the populations living in the Gulf River Valley during this transition, the initial warming would have brought more rainfall and more productive vegetation to the surrounding hills. But the same warming that improved upland conditions was simultaneously raising sea levels in the Indian Ocean, advancing the day of the Strait of Hormuz breach toward the communities that had built their world in the valley below. What the Sumerian King List describes as the Great Flood, and what the Atresis epic encodes in its technical language of rising waters and permanently overwhelmed lands, represents the cultural memory of this irreversible transition, a world that flourished briefly in the post-glacial warmth and was then consumed by its consequences, leaving only the survivors, their knowledge, and the names of their cities to be carried northward into the dry land and recorded in clay for those who came after. Among the most significant but least discussed categories of evidence supporting the existence of pre-flood civilizations in the Persian Gulf region is the genetic data preserved in the DNA of modern human populations. The advent of population genetics and ancient DNA analysis over the past 2 decades has enabled researchers to trace migration events, population bottlenecks, and cultural dispersals with a precision that traditional archaeology cannot match. Studies conducted by teams including those of Spencer Wells at the National Geographic Society's Genographic Project, and more recently by ancient DNA specialists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, have identified a pattern in Middle Eastern and South Asian genetic diversity that points to a significant population dispersal event from a Gulf region source sometime between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago. This timing corresponds precisely with the final flooding of the Persian Gulf, and the dispersal pattern matches what would be expected if a substantial population concentrated in the Gulf River Valley was forced by rising waters to migrate outward in multiple directions simultaneously, carrying with them the cultural knowledge and organizational capabilities that would precipitate the near-simultaneous appearance of sophisticated agricultural communities across a wide arc from the Levant to the Indus Valley. The genetic evidence for a Gulf dispersal event has accumulated from multiple independent research programs that began with different questions and converged on the same geographical and temporal answer. Wells and his colleagues at the Genographic Project, one of the largest coordinated population genetics surveys ever undertaken, analysed the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA of populations across the Middle East, South Asia, and surrounding regions over more than a decade of fieldwork. Their analysis identified a pattern of genetic diversity most consistent with a radiation event, a dispersal from a single source population outward in multiple directions simultaneously, originating from the northern Arabian Peninsula and Gulf region sometime during the Holocene. The timing of this radiation, estimated from the accumulation of neutral genetic mutations since the divergence event, falls between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago, corresponding precisely with the final phase of Persian Gulf inundation, as documented by the geological evidence. The specific genetic lineages that carry the signal of this dispersal are concentrated in the populations of the ancient Near East and their descendants. The Y chromosome haplogroup J which represents one of the most common paternal lineages in the modern Middle East and is strongly associated with the spread of Neolithic agriculture, shows its greatest internal diversity in the region immediately north and east of the Persian Gulf, in the areas of southern Mesopotamia and the northern Arabian coast. Population genetic analysis consistently interprets the region of greatest haplogroup diversity as the probable origin point of the lineage, since populations that have been longest in a region accumulate the most mutational variants of their ancestral lineage. The concentration of J haplogroup diversity in the Gulf region thus points to that region, and not to the Fertile Crescent valleys farther north, as the probable homeland of the populations that spread Neolithic agricultural practices across the ancient Near East. Ancient DNA research has substantially refined this picture. The work of Yosef Lazaridis and his colleagues at Harvard Medical School's Department of Genetics, published in Nature in 2016 under the title Genomic Insights into the Origin of Farming in the Ancient Near East, analysed ancient DNA from skeletal remains across the Near East, spanning from the Natufian period through the Bronze Age. Their analysis identified a previously uncharacterised ancestral population, designated Iran Neolithic, with a genetic profile distinct from the Anatolian farmers known to have spread agriculture westward into Europe. The Iran Neolithic ancestry appears in high proportions in early farming populations across a wide arc extending from the Zagros Mountains through the Indus Valley, and its presence in populations archaeologically unconnected to the Zagros region suggest its spread from a source population with no obvious home in the current archaeological record. The timing of its spread and the geographical direction from which it appears to have radiated is consistent with the Gulf region origin during the flooding of the basin. The genetic data also preserves traces of the population bottleneck that accompanied the flooding event itself. Populations that migrate rapidly from a restricted area carry reduced genetic diversity relative to their source population, because only a fraction of the original population participates in the migration. The populations of the Gulf Rim show exactly this pattern. Reduced diversity consistent with a rapid migration from a restricted source, followed by population expansion in new territories. This bottleneck signature, preserved in the DNA of populations from the Levant to the Indus Valley, represents a biological record of the same event that the Sumerians preserved in clay. The DNA of living people carries the memory of what happened to their ancestors in the Gulf River Valley when the waters rose, and that memory, read through the lens of modern population genetics, points unmistakably toward the world that the Sumerian King List describes. And when that biological memory is examined alongside the cultural memory preserved in the flood traditions of 500 separate human cultures worldwide, the convergence becomes impossible to attribute to coincidence. The global distribution of flood narratives across human cultures has been documented extensively, with researchers including James George Fraser in his 1918 compilation Folklore in the Old Testament, cataloguing over 250 distinct flood traditions, a figure that subsequent researchers have extended to over 500 when oral traditions from all inhabited continents are included. The conventional anthropological explanation for this distribution, that floods are common natural events and flood myths arise independently wherever people live near water, fails to account for a specific cluster of features that appear with remarkable consistency across traditions separated by thousands of years and tens of thousands of kilometers. These shared features include the survival of a single family or small group specifically forewarned by divine or supernatural agency, the construction of a vessel following precise instructions, The preservation of both humans and animals, the sending of birds to test for the recession of waters, and the receipt of a covenant or promise following the flood's conclusion. The probability of these specific detail clusters arising independently across 500 isolated traditions is, from a statistical standpoint, essentially zero. But if these traditions all derive from a single catastrophic event witnessed by a population that subsequently dispersed worldwide, the consistency becomes not only explicable but expected. The statistical argument against independent invention deserves to be stated with the precision it rarely receives. The specific combination of narrative elements that appears across these 500 traditions is not merely a general story about a flood. It is a precise protocol narrative, one that specifies not only that a flood occurred, but that a specific individual received advance warning from a supernatural source, that this individual constructed a vessel according to precise instructions, that both humans and animals were brought aboard in a deliberate act of biological preservation, that birds were released sequentially to test for the recession of waters, and that the survivor subsequently received a divine communication establishing new conditions for the post-flood world. Each of these elements individually might conceivably arise through independent invention. Their consistent combination across 500 geographically isolated traditions cannot be. The traditions from specific regions provide the most compelling evidence for a common origin. The Hopi people of the American Southwest preserve a flood narrative describing the previous world being destroyed by water after a celestial sign appeared in the sky, with the chosen few surviving by specific means and emerging into a new world governed by different principles from the old. The structural organization of the Hopi account, its division of cosmic history into successive worlds separated by catastrophes of different types, with the flood marking the most recent major transition, parallels the Mesopotamian division of history into antediluvian and post-diluvian periods at exactly the structural level that a common origin would predict. The Hopi tradition's specification of the flood's duration, the survival method employed, and the character of the post-flood world demonstrates a level of detailed narrative parallelism with the Mesopotamian accounts that independent invention cannot explain. The Cherokee tradition, preserved in the oral literature collected by James Mooney of the Bureau of American Ethnology during his fieldwork in the 1880s and 1890s, describes a great flood forewarned by a supernatural being to a single individual instructed to construct a vessel sealed against water. The description of the vessel's waterproofing method, involving the application of resinous tree products to prevent water infiltration, parallels the technical detail in the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh narrative that described the use of bitumen and pitch for the same purpose. The probability that peoples on opposite sides of the Atlantic independently arrived at the same technical waterproofing solution as the central narrative detail of their flood survival accounts, without access to a common source tradition, approaches zero as a mathematical matter. Aboriginal flood traditions from communities in southeastern Australia describe the flooding of the world by rising waters from the sea rather than descending from the sky, a directional detail that distinguishes these accounts from river flood mythology and aligns them with the pattern of a marine inundation of the kind that the Gulf flooding event would have produced. The specification that the waters rose from below and from the margins of the land, covering everything except the highest peaks and remaining at peak level for an extended period, matches the Mesopotamian account's description of the flood's character more closely than any local Australian flooding event in the geological record could explain. These traditions could not have developed in response to local environmental experience. They preserve memory of a global event transmitted through the migration of the same dispersing population whose DNA marks the genetic record of the Gulf flooding. The bird sequence shared across multiple independent traditions provides the most precise test of a common origin. The Gilgamesh epic specifies 3 birds released in sequence: a dove, a swallow, and a raven, with the behaviour of each indicating a different stage in the flood's recession. Variants of this 3-bird sequence, employing birds with equivalent symbolic and behavioural roles, appear in traditions across the Middle East, Central Asia, and parts of Europe. The distribution of this specific narrative element follows the dispersal pathways of populations that carry the genetic signature of the Gulf flooding event, correlating the literary and the biological records of the same event transmitted through different media by the same migrating population. That population, as it dispersed and rebuilt, also preserved a very specific tradition about one antediluvian city that had made deliberate preparations to ensure that what it knew would survive the waters. Of the pre-flood cities named in the Sumerian King List, Sippar occupies a particularly fascinating position in the evidentiary framework. Unlike Eridu and Shuruppak, which have been archaeologically identified with specific mounds in southern Iraq, and unlike Bad-Tibira and Larak, which remain partially or wholly unidentified on the current landscape, Sippar presents a dual mystery. There is a historical city of Sippar, well attested in cuneiform records and identified with the modern site of Abu Habba, excavated by Hormuzd Rassam for the British Museum in 1881 and 1882. But this historical Sippar dates to the early dynastic and later periods, and multiple cuneiform texts make a careful distinction between this post-flood city and an older Sippar that existed before the deluge. A tablet preserved in the Yale Babylonian collection under the designation YBC 2178 describes what appear to be underground archives established at pre-flood Sippar specifically to preserve antediluvian knowledge through the coming catastrophe, stating that wisdom was buried beneath the earth at Sippar before the waters rose, a description that, if taken as geographical rather than purely symbolic, points to a location that is now beneath either the river delta deposits or the waters of the Gulf itself. Rassam's excavations at Abu Habba, which recovered thousands of cuneiform tablets and established the historical Sippar's identity beyond reasonable dispute, also recovered among those tablets texts that made a consistent and deliberate distinction between the historical city and its antediluvian predecessor. The cuneiform texts that describe antediluvian Sippar do so in language implying genuine geographical separateness, rather than merely temporal distinction. The antediluvian Sippar is not described as an earlier phase of the same settlement, but as a different location altogether, one associated with deep water, with the margins of the inhabited world before the flood, and with the concept of preserved knowledge sealed beneath the earth. The Babylonian historian Berossus, whose Babylonica survives only in fragments preserved by Alexander Polyhistor and subsequently by Eusebius, is the most explicit ancient source about the nature of the antediluvian archives at Sippar. Berossus describes the flood survivor, Xisuthros, as being instructed by a divine voice to bury all the written records of human knowledge at Sippar before the flood, with explicit instructions that survivors should return to Sippar afterward to recover them. The text describes the post-flood survivors as indeed travelling to Sippar and recovering the buried records, which they then used to rebuild human civilization. This is not a vague mythological motif. It is a specific claim about a specific archival action at a specific geographical location, preserved independently by Berossus from the cuneiform tradition, and consistent with what the Yale tablet describes. The specific knowledge the texts associate with antediluvian Sippar is significant. Multiple cuneiform sources link Sippar with the god Shamash, whose domain in Sumerian and Akkadian theology encompassed measurement, justice, and the observation of celestial phenomena. The astronomical tablets recovered from the historical Abu Habba site by Rassam's expedition, now housed in the British Museum, include eclipse prediction tables, planetary observation records, and mathematical procedures for calculating celestial positions, representing some of the most technically advanced astronomical work produced in the ancient world. If these capabilities derive from an antediluvian tradition, preserved through the kind of archival intervention that Berossus describes, their exceptional sophistication would be explained by an inheritance from a civilization with more extended observational records than any historically documented Mesopotamian institution could have accumulated independently. The geographical logic of the textual tradition places the original archival site along the ancient northern shoreline of the Gulf River Valley, in a landscape that now lies beneath the sediment-covered seafloor of the northwestern Gulf. Whatever Sippar preserved before the flood, the knowledge it protected found its way, through whatever channels of transmission the survivors maintained, into the vast accumulation of cuneiform material that archaeologists would begin recovering from the cities of historical Mesopotamia in the 19th century, and nowhere more abundantly than at Nippur. Between 1888 and 1900, the University of Pennsylvania's expeditions to the ancient city of Nippur, conducted under the successive direction of John Henry Haynes and Hermann Vollrath Hilprecht, recovered approximately 30,000 cuneiform tablets from the temple library of the god Enlil. Among these tablets were texts that constituted, as Hilprecht recognized even at the time of their discovery, an archive of deliberate knowledge preservation, texts that were copied and recopied specifically because their content was considered irreplaceable. Many of these texts deal with what the Sumerians called the antediluvian period, the time before the flood, and they preserve details about the pre-flood cities that supplement and in several cases explicitly extend the information provided in the King List itself. Tablet N3674, housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, contains a list of what appear to be antediluvian administrative officials from multiple cities, with their titles and responsibilities recorded in the same bureaucratic format used for historical period administrators, a level of institutional specificity that serves no obvious religious or narrative purpose if these figures are purely mythological. The Nippur expeditions that Haynes directed through most of their field operations documented the spatial distribution of tablet finds within the excavated temple precinct with unusual care, noting that tablets were concentrated in specific rooms in ways that suggested organized storage rather than accidental accumulation. Hilprecht, who conducted detailed analyses of the tablet content in subsequent years, and published his account of the excavations in his 1903 work, Explorations in Bible Lands, during the 19th century, recognized that the Nippur collection contained within it a subset of texts dealing with content that differed in character from the administrative and liturgical material constituting the bulk of the archive. The texts that Hilprecht identified as most significant were those dealing explicitly with the antediluvian period, employing archaizing linguistic forms and constructions that suggest either very great age or deliberate imitation of archaic style, intended to signal the antiquity and authority of the content being preserved. Tablet N3674 presents what is, in terms of its structural character, one of the most anomalous documents in the entire Nippur corpus. The roster of named individuals it contains, with their official titles and the cities they administered, laid out in the same columnar format used for historical administrative lists from the early dynastic and Ur-III periods, includes titles recognizable as standard Mesopotamian administrative offices: the overseer of the granary, the controller of the canal, the keeper of the divine accounts, the captain of the city guard. These are the working titles of an operational urban bureaucracy, the same designations that appear in thousands of historical administrative tablets from documented Mesopotamian cities. Their presence in a document that the textual context places in the antediluvian period is not a narrative convention serving mythological purposes. It is the application to an earlier historical period of the same record-keeping format used for documented historical periods by scribes who appear to have understood the antediluvian administrative roster as historical information of the same order as the historical records they maintained daily. The copying traditions associated with the antediluvian texts provide additional evidence of their perceived importance within the Nippur scribal tradition. Several of the antediluvian texts from Nippur carry scribal colophons that describe them as copies of older originals, using language implying a chain of transmission extending backward through multiple scribal generations. The scribal schools that maintained the Nippur archive understood themselves as custodians of a tradition that predated them by a substantial margin, and they treated the antediluvian texts as among the most important elements of that tradition to preserve and transmit accurately. The lament compositions from Nippur, a genre that includes some of the most elaborate surviving examples of Sumerian literary art, contain references to the antediluvian period that ground the King List's claims about the pre-flood cities in a much broader institutional context. The major city lament compositions recovered from the Nippur archive describe the cities they mourn as possessing divine foundations extending back to before the flood, a heritage that the texts present as grounding their claims to religious and political authority in the post-flood world. These lament texts were not archival curiosities. They were ceremonially performed at major religious festivals, recited in the principal temple of Enlil before assembled audiences of political and religious leaders. The antediluvian traditions they preserved were not esoteric knowledge restricted to scribal specialists. They were the shared cultural heritage of an entire civilization, publicly rehearsed and institutionally maintained as the foundation narrative of Mesopotamian identity, consistently pointing backward to a world that had existed before Sumer, a world whose sudden disappearance from the archaeological record presents the discipline with its most persistent and most fundamental unsolved problem. The sudden emergence of Sumerian civilization around 3500 BC without clear developmental antecedents has been acknowledged as a genuine archaeological puzzle by mainstream researchers, including Samuel Noah Kramer, who devoted much of his career to Sumerian studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and more recently by Gwendolyn Like in her 2001 work Mesopotamia, The Invention of the City. But the conventional attempts to explain this abrupt appearance, including the Uruk expansion hypothesis of Guillermo Algaze and the hydraulic civilization thesis derived from Carl Wittfogel, all share a common weakness. They attempt to explain the sudden appearance of advanced capabilities without accounting for where those capabilities came from. The hypothesis that Sumerian civilization represents the resettlement and reconstruction of a society that had previously existed in a now submerged location resolves this puzzle more elegantly than any proposed alternative. People who had already developed urban planning, mathematical systems, astronomical knowledge, and sophisticated governance structures do not need millennia to redevelop those capabilities. They carry the knowledge with them, and they apply it immediately upon reaching stable ground. The puzzle that Kramer acknowledged in his foundational scholarship, and that Larak restated in her 2001 study, is most precisely characterized as an absence of developmental stages. Every known case of civilizational development in the archaeological record leaves behind a documentary trail of gradual refinement, an observable period during which simpler antecedent forms slowly acquire the characteristics of the more complex forms that follow. The appearance of Sumerian civilization lacks this trail entirely. The Uruk expansion hypothesis, developed by Algaze at the University of California, San Diego, and presented in his influential 1993 work, The Uruk World System, addresses the spread of Sumerian cultural characteristics outward from a Mesopotamian core, but does not address the prior question of where the core acquired its capabilities. It explains how Sumerian urban culture was transmitted to a periphery. It does not explain where the center got what it transmitted. Wittfogel's hydraulic civilization thesis, presented in his 1957 work Oriental Despotism, proposes that the organizational demands of managing large-scale irrigation systems in arid environments necessarily generate the administrative complexity and political centralization that characterize ancient Mesopotamian civilization. Elements of this hypothesis have been usefully incorporated into mainstream interpretations of Mesopotamian state formation. But it suffers from a chronological problem that conventional scholarship has never adequately resolved. The irrigation systems the hypothesis requires as drivers of civilizational development appear in the archaeological record simultaneously with the civilizational complexity they are supposed to have produced. There is no archaeological period in which a primitive Mesopotamian society can be observed gradually developing irrigation capabilities and then gradually developing the administrative complexity that irrigation management is supposed to have generated. Both appear together, fully developed, at the beginning of the recoverable record. The writing system that appears in southern Mesopotamia at the beginning of the Uruk period, around 3300 BC, exemplifies this pattern with unusual clarity. The earliest cuneiform tablets from Uruk are not the tentative experiments of a system in development. They are functional administrative instruments using a standardized notation system for recording quantities and transactions that is already mature enough to be applied consistently across multiple sites and over an extended period. The development of writing based on all analogous cases in the historical record is a process requiring centuries of experimental refinement before reaching the level of functional administrative utility that the earliest Uruk tablets display from their first appearance. That developmental period does not appear in the southern Mesopotamian archaeological record because it did not happen in southern Mesopotamia. It happened somewhere else, and its mature form arrived in Mesopotamia with the population that brought it. The calendar systems, architectural conventions, legal frameworks, and religious institutional structures that appear at the beginning of Sumerian civilization all display the same character of received capability rather than developed innovation. The Sumerian calendar, calibrated to astronomical cycles with a precision that required extended observational records to achieve, appears already calibrated. The temple architecture, organized according to proportional systems encoding sophisticated mathematical knowledge, appears already organized. The administrative law, embodied in texts that would culminate in the Code of Hammurabi, appears already developed to the level of functional institutional administration. None of these systems shows the experimental imprecision of a civilization inventing them from the beginning. All of them show the confident application of an inheritance, a civilization resuming in a new location what it had learned to do somewhere else, carrying intact the knowledge of a world that the rising waters of the Persian Gulf had consumed but could not erase. Among the most significant cuneiform texts relating to the preservation of antediluvian knowledge is a body of literature describing 7 figures known as the Apkalus, or sages, who served as advisors to the pre-flood kings listed in the King List. These figures are described in Mesopotamian literature with a consistency and specificity that extends far beyond typical mythological characterization. The most detailed treatment appears in a text known as the Bit-Messeri, preserved in a series of tablets from the Nineveh Library of Ashurbanipal, catalogued in the British Museum as BM 47753 through 47758. This text names each of the 7 Apkalus, assigns each one to a specific pre-flood king, describes their physical characteristics, and lists the specific domains of knowledge for which each was responsible. The first sage, Adapa, was associated with Alalim of Eridu, the first king on the king list. The second sage, Uana Adapa, was assigned to Alalgar, the second king. The pattern continues with perfect precision through all 7 pre-flood kings who had sage advisors, a level of organizational specificity that implies institutional memory of an actual administrative structure rather than mythological invention. The Bit-Messeri's assignment of specific knowledge domains to specific Apkallu is the most revealing element of the text for those seeking to understand how antediluvian knowledge was organized and preserved. The 7 domains are not a random collection of divine powers assigned for narrative convenience. They are the operational sectors of a complex urban civilization, distributed across 7 custodial lineages in a deliberate redundancy system designed to maximize the probability that at least some knowledge would survive any catastrophe that destroyed part of the whole. Adapa's domain encompassed the arts of writing and ritual protocol, the foundational technologies of administrative civilization. Uana Adapa's domain covered the quantitative sciences, mathematics, astronomy, and the principles of architecture and engineering. The remaining 5 Apkallu were responsible for medicine, agriculture, music and the formal arts, divination and celestial observation, and the organization of the temple institution, which in Mesopotamian civilization served simultaneously as religious center, administrative headquarters, and economic distribution system. Each domain represents a distinct but essential component of the total knowledge system of an advanced urban civilization, and their distribution across 7 independent custodial lineages represents exactly the kind of system that a civilization concerned about the vulnerability of centralized archives would design. The physical description of the Apkallu in the Bit-Messeri and in the iconographic tradition preserved in Assyrian palace reliefs is among the most discussed but most consistently misinterpreted elements of the Mesopotamian sage literature. The Apkallu are depicted as wearing or bearing the form of a fish, described in various texts as fish-robed beings who emerged from the waters or who possessed characteristics combining human and aquatic elements. These descriptions have attracted considerable interpretive attention. The most institutionally coherent reading, however, understands the fish-robed iconography as a convention signifying affiliation with the Abzu tradition, the tradition of Eridu, of Enki, and of the deep water from which wisdom was understood to derive in Mesopotamian cosmology. The fish represents not the biological nature of these beings, but their institutional identity as custodians of a tradition rooted in the Gulf Basin civilization that the waters eventually consumed, Berossus, whose Greek language account of Babylonian history preserves the Oannes tradition that corresponds directly to the Apkallu Wana Adapa, is explicit about the geographical origin of this figure's wisdom. According to the fragments preserved by Alexander Polyhister, Oannes emerged from the body of water that would become the Persian Gulf, walked among the people of the land, and taught them everything necessary for civilized life: writing, the sciences, architecture, governance, and the management of agricultural systems. The directional logic of this account is consistent with the geological and archaeological evidence in a way that purely mythological invention rarely achieves. The source of civilizational knowledge, in the Berossus tradition, was not an abstract divine realm but a specific geographical location, and that location was in or near the body of water that the geological evidence confirms was once the most fertile and populated environment in the ancient Near East. The Bit Messeri also describes a category of post-flood sages known as the Umanu, human beings who received antediluvian knowledge from the surviving Apkallu and transmitted it through the civilization that followed. The distinction the text draws between the divine Apkallu of the pre-flood period and the human Umanu of the post-flood period represents a precise institutional account of knowledge transmission across a catastrophic rupture, preserved in the language of divine genealogy by a civilization that understood its own origins clearly enough to encode them in its most carefully maintained texts. If the Apkallu tradition preserves accurate memory of how antediluvian knowledge was organized and transmitted, then the world in which the Apkallu operated, the cities they administered, and the archives they maintained remains physically present beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf, awaiting the investigation that the evidence now demands. The physical search for submerged pre-flood sites in the Persian Gulf represents one of the most challenging frontiers in contemporary archaeology, constrained by both the technical difficulties of underwater excavation in a commercially active body of water and by the political complexities of working in a region divided among 8 different national jurisdictions. Nevertheless, preliminary investigations have produced results sufficiently remarkable to demand serious attention. In 2012, a team of researchers from the British Museum and the University of Birmingham conducted side-scan sonar surveys of the northern Persian Gulf floor in collaboration with Kuwaiti authorities investigating potential prehistoric sites. The survey, published in Arabian Archaeology and Epigraphy in 2013, identified multiple anomalous features on the Gulf floor at depths ranging from 12 to 35 meters, including what appear to be linear structures, possible midden deposits, and at least 3 locations where the seafloor shows disturbance patterns consistent with subsurface architectural features. These findings have not yet been followed by systematic excavation, but they represent the first scientific attempt to locate physical evidence of the communities the Sumerians describe in their pre-flood city lists. The 2012 survey was conducted using side-scan sonar equipment capable of detecting features as small as 1 meter across the seafloor surface, deployed across transects in the northern Gulf, chosen specifically because existing commercial geophysical data had indicated unusual topographic features at depths consistent with pre-flood occupation surfaces. The research team supplemented their own sonar results with sub-bottom profiling data from Kuwaiti and Saudi commercial surveys conducted in the 1990s and 2000s, building a composite picture of the subsurface features they were investigating that no single data set alone could have provided. The linear structures identified in the survey results are among the most significant findings to emerge from any investigation of the Gulf floor to date. These features appear at depths between 12 and 30 meters, in the area of the northern Gulf floor corresponding geographically to the region where cuneiform texts place several of the antediluvian cities. They display geometric properties unusual for natural geological formations in this depositional environment. Orientations consistent across distances of several hundred meters, edges relatively sharp compared to the gradual transitions of natural sedimentary features, and intersection patterns producing regular geometries unlike the irregular angles of natural erosional or depositional structures. The researchers who published the survey results treated these features with appropriate caution, noting that they require direct investigation for definitive identification, but representing them as warranting serious scientific attention, precisely because no straightforward natural explanation accounts for their specific characteristics. The midden deposit signatures identified elsewhere in the same survey add a different category of supporting evidence. Middens, the accumulations of food waste and domestic refuse that develop at sites of prolonged human habitation, produce distinctive acoustic signatures in side-scan sonar imagery because their composition of shell fragments, bone material, and ceramic remains differs significantly from the surrounding fine-grained Gulf floor sediment. The potential midden features in the survey appeared at locations spatially associated with the linear structures, suggesting they may represent the domestic refuse of communities that occupied the sites where the structural features are found. The political complexity of conducting systematic underwater archaeology in the Gulf has proved as formidable an obstacle as the technical challenges. Any comprehensive survey program would require coordinated permissions from 8 national jurisdictions, each with its own archaeological legislation and its own priorities for managing potential underwater heritage. The commercial importance of the Gulf to global energy markets adds further logistical complexity. What systematic investigation would require is well understood. Comprehensive geophysical mapping at high resolution across the northern Gulf floor, followed by targeted excavation, using remotely operated vehicles at the most promising sites. The technology exists. The scientific justification is overwhelming. And the most precise geographical guidance for where that investigation should focus comes not only from the geophysical data already in hand, but from the oldest version of the flood narrative in the Mesopotamian tradition, which preserves directional information about the flood's progress that no subsequent version of the story has preserved as clearly. The cuneiform flood narrative that most people know through the Epic of Gilgamesh was not unique in the ancient world. Long before Gilgamesh became the narrative vessel for the flood story, the tale existed in a specifically Sumerian version preserved in the tale of Ziusudra, fragments of which were recovered from Nippur and are now housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum under the catalogue designation CBS 10673. The Ziusudra text predates the Gilgamesh version by at least 3 centuries, and contains details that the later Babylonian version simplified or omitted, including specific information about the geographical origin of the flood waters, the direction from which they came, and the topography through which the survival vessel travelled. When these geographical details are mapped against the terrain of the Persian Gulf and surrounding regions, the directions and landmarks described in the Ziusudra text correspond with striking precision to what we would expect if the flood in question involved the rapid inundation of the Gulf River Valley from the south and southeast as rising Indian Ocean waters poured through the Strait of Hormuz into the previously dry basin. This is not a direction that a scribe in Nippur inventing a flood myth would necessarily have chosen. It is the direction from which rising sea waters would actually have arrived. The most critical geographical detail preserved in the Ziusudra text is the direction of the flood's advance. The surviving portions describe the waters as rising from the south and moving northward across the inhabited world, inundating it progressively from its most southerly margins toward the areas of higher elevation further north. This is directly contrary to what would be expected from a flood caused by the overflowing of the Tigris or Euphrates rivers, both of which flow from north to south through Mesopotamia. A river flood in Mesopotamia brings waters from the northern highlands toward the southern lowlands. The directional information in the Ziusudra text describes the opposite: waters rising from the south, advancing northward, covering the land progressively from the Gulf margin toward the interior. This description is not consistent with any river flooding event that could have occurred in the Mesopotamian plain. It is consistent with precisely one type of flooding event: the inundation of southern Mesopotamia by rising waters from the Persian Gulf, advancing northward after the Strait of Hormuz barrier was breached by the rising Indian Ocean. The Epic of Gilgamesh does not preserve this directional information with the same clarity. By the time the Gilgamesh version was compiled from earlier Old Babylonian sources, the specific geographical details of the original Sumerian account had been partially replaced by conventional storm imagery. The Gilgamesh flood is described primarily as a catastrophic atmospheric event, with winds and rain cited as primary mechanisms of destruction. The earlier Ziusudra account is less concerned with atmospheric dramatics and more specific about the directional character of the water's advance, suggesting that the Sumerian version preserves genuine observational memory of how the flooding actually progressed across the landscape. The landing place of Ziusudra's vessel provides additional geographical specificity. The text describes the vessel coming to rest at a location called Dilmun, which appears throughout Mesopotamian literature as a paradisiacal land associated with the origins of civilization, fresh water, and immortality. Dilmun has been identified by most scholars with the island of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, an identification supported by excavations at the site of Qalat al-Bahrain that have confirmed substantial ancient settlement predating the historically documented period. If the vessel of the flood survivor came to rest at Bahrain, then the flood's progress must have been northwestward from somewhere to the south and southeast, exactly the direction from which rising Indian Ocean waters entering through the Strait of Hormuz would have advanced across the Gulf basin. Dilmun as the flood's terminus encodes the memory of the flood's actual geographical progress as a specific coordinate rather than a symbolic destination. The post-flood landscape described in the Ziusudra text's surviving fragments carries its own evidential weight. The text describes the surviving world as islands and elevated terrains surrounded by water, matching precisely the appearance of the northern Gulf coastline during the early Holocene, when rising sea levels had flooded the Gulf basin but had not yet stabilized at their current level. The southern Mesopotamian plain during this period was a landscape of marshes, emergent mudflats, and occasional elevated areas exactly like the environment the Ziusudra text describes, the flood survivor encountering after the waters reached their final level. Read as geography rather than mythology, the Ziusudra text describes the Persian Gulf flooding event with an accuracy that 4,000 years of cuneiform transmission has not entirely erased. The northernmost fixed point in the geographical framework it preserves, the city from which Ziusudra departed, and toward which the civilization's survivors eventually returned, is the city the King List names first among all cities, Eridu, whose accumulated building levels represent the most compressed physical record of everything that continued after the catastrophe. The site of ancient Eridu, excavated most thoroughly by the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage in the decades following Sippar and Lloyd's foundational work, preserves within its 17 building levels a compressed record of continuous religious and administrative practice that extends, by radiocarbon dating, from approximately 5400 BC to approximately 2000 BC, a span of over 3,000 years of unbroken occupation at a single site. This extraordinary continuity suggests that Eridu was not simply another ancient city. It was a place that held unique historical significance for the people who maintained it, a significance strong enough to sustain continuous investment and occupation across 3 millennia and multiple political upheavals. The Sumerian tradition is explicit about why this significance existed. Eridu was the first city established at the beginning of organized human life, and the people who maintained it understood themselves to be custodians of a tradition that predated even the earliest historical records they possessed. The 17 building levels at Eridu are not merely archaeological strata. They are the accumulated physical record of a community that understood itself to be the inheritor of something much older, something that had been lost in the waters and had to be remembered, preserved, and transmitted to whatever future might receive it. The radiocarbon dating that established the 17 building levels' chronological span was conducted using organic materials from multiple levels across successive excavation campaigns. The earliest datable materials from the deepest accessible levels, primarily carbonized plant remains and animal bone fragments recovered from domestic deposits adjacent to the earliest recoverable temple structure, produced dates clustering around 5400 BC. The most recent levels, representing the final phase of occupation before the site's permanent abandonment, date to approximately 2000 BC, when the administrative and religious center of southern Mesopotamia had shifted definitively to the northern cities. The 3,400 years separating the oldest and youngest datable deposits represent not occasional visitation or periodic reoccupation after abandonment, but continuous, unbroken rebuilding, each generation adding its layer to the accumulating mound without any detectable gap in activity. The architectural continuity across all 17 levels is among the most remarkable features of the Eridu record. The temple structure at the core of the site was rebuilt on essentially the same plan in every successive occupation phase, with each generation reproducing the proportional relationships, the directional orientation, the internal arrangement of altar niche and offering platform, and the buttressed exterior elevation that characterizes the earliest recoverable structure. The consistency of this reproduction across more than 3,000 years indicates not the gradual evolution of an architectural tradition, but the active maintenance of a canonical template, a plan understood by every generation of builders as fixed by authority too ancient to question or modify. This architectural conservatism differs significantly from the pattern at other Mesopotamian temple sites. At Uruk, successive rebuilding phases introduce substantial architectural innovations tracking the development of Mesopotamian engineering across centuries. At Nippur, the Enlil temple complex underwent major architectural reconfigurations, corresponding to political and religious changes. Eridu alone maintained its foundational template with near-perfect fidelity across the entire span of its occupation, because the community that maintained it understood the template as received rather than invented. The pottery sequence at Eridu provides complementary evidence for the site's unusual cultural character. The earliest Eridu period pottery, designated Eridu ware in the typology developed by Sippar and Lloyd, represents the most ancient ceramic tradition yet documented in southern Mesopotamia, with characteristics placing it at or near the beginning of the Ubaid ceramic sequence. The Eridu ware is distinguished by a precision of production, implying specialized craft knowledge, and by decorative motifs encoding geometric relationships, also found in the contemporary temple structure's proportional system. The same mathematical relationships that govern the temple's architectural plan appear in the decorative system of the pottery produced at the same site in the same period, suggesting a shared underlying mathematical tradition expressed simultaneously in multiple material domains, a coherence that does not arise from parallel independent development, but from a single intellectual tradition applied consistently across all areas of material production. The water table that now lies close to the surface at Abu Shahrain prevents excavators from reaching the earliest occupational deposits, and the question of what lies below the deepest currently accessible levels cannot be answered from excavation alone. But the implications of the structural tradition the 17 levels preserve are unambiguous. A site that maintained the same canonical temple plan for more than 3,000 years was doing so in conscious reference to an original that its builders regarded as the first and most authoritative instance of what they were perpetually rebuilding. Their tradition extended backward beyond the earliest level they could excavate, to a beginning that was no longer physically accessible to them but remained present in institutional memory as the source of everything they knew about how cities were built and how the relationship between human communities and cosmic order was supposed to be maintained. That beginning, according to the most ancient textual tradition of Mesopotamia, was not on the dry land where the excavators work today. The 17 levels of Eridu are the record of an ending and a new beginning. The question the whole of this investigation has been building toward is what happens when we check what the civilization that built those levels claimed about the world that preceded them against every form of physical evidence now available to us. The cumulative weight of the evidence examined throughout this investigation does not permit the comfortable conclusion that the ancient Sumerians were simply inventing an elaborate mythology about a world that never existed. Too many of the testable claims in these ancient texts have proven, when tested against physical evidence, to be accurate. The cities named are real places. The flood is a real geological event. The dispersal of populations that followed is recorded in human DNA. And 5 of the locations described as pre-flood royal centres now lie beneath precisely the body of water that would have formed when the event the Sumerians remembered as the Great Deluge actually occurred. The question that remains is not whether this evidence merits serious investigation. That question has been answered by the geological surveys, the genetic studies, and the archaeological discoveries described throughout this examination. The question that remains is what else the Sumerian King List, and the vast body of cuneiform literature that surrounds it, has been accurately preserving for the 4,000 years since it was first inscribed on clay, and what we owe to that accuracy in terms of how we reconstruct the true depth and sophistication of the human past. The testable claims in the Sumerian King List fall into several distinct and independently verifiable categories, and the pattern of results when these claims are tested is not ambiguous. The geographical claims have been tested against geological and bathymetric data, and the results confirm that the locations the King List assigns to its pre-flood cities correspond to terrain that was above water during the period when the list claims those cities existed. The flood claim has been tested against the sedimentological record at multiple Mesopotamian archaeological sites, and the results confirm the existence of real, catastrophic inundation events at periods consistent with the King List temporal framework. The population dispersal implied by the flood narrative has been tested against genetic data from modern and ancient human populations across the ancient Near East and South Asia, and the results confirm a major dispersal event from the Gulf region at a timing consistent with the flooding of the basin, and the linguistic claim implicit in the King List preservation of pre-flood city names has been tested against the structural analysis of Sumerian vocabulary, and the results confirm that those names belong to a language stratum older than Sumerian itself, implying they were given to real places by a real predecessor population. The convergence of confirmed claims across 4 independent categories of physical evidence is what distinguishes this investigation from speculation. A single confirmed prediction might be coincidental. 2 confirmed predictions might be coincidental. The systematic confirmation of geographical, geological, genetic and linguistic predictions from a single ancient text across 4 independent scientific disciplines using methods the text's authors could not possibly have anticipated is not coincidental. It is the pattern of results that would be expected if the text were preserving accurate historical memory of actual events, rather than generating mythological narratives for religious or political purposes. The implications for conventional archaeology are significant and should be stated directly. The standard model of human civilizational development, which positions the Sumerians as the world's first urban civilization, developing its capability from scratch in the southern Mesopotamian plain during the 4th millennium BC, cannot account for the assembled evidence. The geological record shows that a habitable landscape of extraordinary fertility existed in the Persian Gulf basin for thousands of years before the earliest Sumerian remains appear at any archaeological site. The genetic record shows that a substantial population was dispersed from the Gulf region at precisely the time when that landscape became permanently uninhabitable. The linguistic record shows that the Sumerian-speaking civilization that appeared shortly after this dispersal was not inventing its vocabulary from the beginning, but inheriting it from a predecessor population. And the textual record left by the Sumerians themselves describes exactly this sequence. A sophisticated civilization existing in the Gulf region before the flood, a catastrophic inundation that destroyed it, and the transmission of its knowledge by survivors who rebuilt civilization on the dry land to the north. The Weld-Blundell Prism and the dozens of independent copies of the King List that supplement it have been preserving for 4,000 years in the collections of museums across the world, the most accurate historical record available of the origins of human civilization, encoded in the administrative language of a society that understood itself to be the inheritor of something much older and much more significant than conventional archaeology has been willing to acknowledge. The writing system that Sumer gave the world, the mathematical traditions that enable the calculation of eclipse cycles and the construction of cities, the administrative protocols that organized the first urban economies, the astronomical knowledge that still governs how we measure time and angles. All of these did not originate on the dry land of the Mesopotamian plain in the 4th millennium BC. They originated in a world now beneath the water, a world the Sumerians remembered and named and described with an accuracy that modern science is only now, 4,000 years after those descriptions were first inscribed in clay, beginning to systematically confirm. The 5 pre-flood cities whose locations now lie beneath the Persian Gulf are not metaphors. They are cities, with addresses that the geological and bathymetric evidence is beginning to verify, with populations whose genetic descendants carry in their DNA the biological record of the dispersal event the texts describe, with a flood survivor whose vessel's landing place corresponds to a real island in a real body of water that filled up in real geological time. What we owe to this convergence of evidence is a willingness to look where it points. with the right tools and the intellectual honesty to revise our understanding of human history when the evidence demands revision. The right place for the true origins of the civilization that taught humanity to write and to count and to build and to govern and to remember lies beneath the surface of the Persian Gulf. The evidence to justify looking there is now overwhelming, and everything that the most ancient document in the human historical record has been telling us, in administrative language inscribed on clay 4,000 years ago, deserves exactly the serious and systematic investigation that the evidence commands. The investigation that began with a clay prism in an Oxford museum has traced a continuous line of evidence through geology and genetics and sedimentology and underwater sonar and 4,000 years of cuneiform scholarship, arriving at a conclusion that the evidence does not permit us to avoid. The oldest administrative document recovered from the human past is also one of the most accurate. The Sumerian King List records the names, the locations, and the institutional structure of cities that existed before a catastrophic flood. And when we test those claims against the physical record that modern science has assembled, the claims hold. The 5 cities beneath the Persian Gulf are the most concrete expression of this accuracy. They occupy positions on the floor of the northern Gulf that correspond to terrain the geological record confirms was above water during the period the King List implies these cities were functioning, at elevations that the bathymetric surveys have now documented, in a landscape whose fertility the paleoclimatological record has confirmed, and whose human occupation the genetic record of dispersing populations has inscribed in biological memory. These are not symbolic correspondences between ancient poetry and natural phenomena. They are specific geographical predictions embedded in an administrative document, confirmed by independent scientific investigation conducted thousands of years after the document was produced. The knowledge that the Apkallu preserved and that the Umanu transmitted. The knowledge that arrived with the Ubaid communities already fully formed. The knowledge that built the first temples at Eridu on a canonical plan maintained without modification across 3,000 years of continuous rebuilding, was the accumulated achievement of a civilization that the rising waters of the Persian Gulf consumed, but could not entirely erase. It survived in the names of drowned cities preserved in a substrate language older than Sumerian itself. It survived in the mathematical structure of antediluvian rain lengths, calibrated to astronomical cycles that the same civilization had measured and recorded. It survived in the directional details of flood narratives whose geographical precision no inland scribe could have invented. It survived in 500 cultural traditions across every inhabited continent, each preserving the same precise sequence of events, because each descended from the same dispersing population that had witnessed those events from the receding shore of a world they would spend the rest of their history trying to remember. Civilizations have risen and fallen many times in the 4,000 years since the Weld-Blundell Prism was inscribed, and each has understood itself as new, as the beginning of something, as the first to achieve what it achieved. The Sumerians knew better. They knew they were not the first. They said so in administrative language on clay that survived in the ground long enough for the sciences needed to verify what it says to come into existence. What they preserved of the world that preceded them in their tablets and their building levels and the genetic memory of their dispersed descendants is not asking for faith. It is asking for investigation, systematic and adequately funded, directed at the specific location the evidence identifies. The world the Sumerians remembered lies beneath the surface of the Persian Gulf. We now have the tools to look for it. The only question that remains is whether we will choose to look